Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this event on one of the most important issues of our time, the future of trade. Some time ago, David Gantz, the Will Clayton Fellow on International Economics and Trade at the Baker Institute and a good friend, and I sat down to think through a project on trade. This was the most pressing issue under the Trump administration, and it remains so today. We were fully aware when we sat down of the risk of the rising skepticism surrounding international commerce, not just from Washington and many Americans, but also from the capitals and the citizens of many other countries around the world. We were also fully aware of the fact that supply chains came under great scrutiny after the COVID-19 pandemic revealed some serious vulnerabilities when some items became scarce and inflation began to rise. We were also aware of the issues surrounding the increasingly tense relationship between the United States and China, which runs through an intense trade relationship on which we came to rely for our own prosperity, but which eventually caught the attention of our politicians and helped get Mr. Trump elected in 2016. We were also conscious of the state of the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Accord, which underwent a revision between 2017 and 2020, and it is now mandated to undergo a review and revision in 2026. All this was also underlain by a technological, military, and diplomatic race between the United States and its main competitor, the People's Republic of China. So, David and I set out to think through all these issues and then called to the table some of the foremost experts on these issues, many of whom you will hear from today. We held conversations, symposia, conferences on these issues surrounding trade today. All of us researched, gathered data, talked, and wrote. And then we collected our thoughts into this volume, which you can now read, The Future of Trade, a North American Perspective. A key question for us was, or questions rather, what went wrong with freer trade? Why the skepticism? Did we misunderstand the benefits of trade? Did we misunderstand the geostrategic utility of trade? Did we misread the ability of national publics to tolerate the sacrifices that freer trade involves? Does that mean that the global economy will have to rely less on trade? Or does that mean that we have to find better ways to distribute the benefits of trade? Will trade be the victim to great power competition, and will we lose its benefits in consequence? How to rebalance both our faith in, but also the benefits of trade. Did we misunderstand how trade distributes or concentrates benefits? Did we misread the working classes that paid a price for trade concentrated costs, while we misread the consumer classes which benefit from trade? What is the role that trade has played in the growing geostrategic competition for power and hegemony? Can trade be had in ways that legitimize its existence and its undeniable benefits? These and many other questions were part of our conversations over time. Indeed, the world cannot live without trade. Not engaging in commerce would actually stall the world economy, but it seems that we need to consider the reasons why so many more people are today increasingly and unwilling and unable to tolerate the costs of trade. So what do? These are some of the questions that we will try to answer to continue our reflection on this issue, in addition to conveying to you some of our thoughts on trade compiled in our volume. We certainly hope this is a useful conversation to demonstrate that trade is considerably more complicated than we thought back in the 1990s, and to show that sometimes, when it is perceived as unfair, it distorts our domestic politics as well and endangers the gains that can be had from it, when well understood and well implemented, of course. So, to begin our conversation, let me introduce our keynote speaker today, C.J. Mahoney, who was here a couple of years back in a conference when we started this particular project, and gave the address, which is the introduction to this volume. C.J. Mahoney is an attorney who serves as a corporate vice president, deputy general counsel at Cloud Plus AI at Microsoft. He was previously a partner at Williams & Connolly. He served as deputy United States Trade Representative. Prior to his government service, Mahoney was a trial lawyer and partner at the Washington, D.C. law firm of Williams & Connolly, LLP, where his practice focused on international commerce arbitration, white-collar defense, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, legal malpractice, and First Amendment law. The United States Senate unanimously confirmed Mahoney to serve as Deputy United States Trade Representative on March 1st, 2018. You can find a lot of information about CJ. It's really a pleasure that he took the time to come down to Houston, where he has a personal connection, and to be with us. So without any further ado, let me invite CJ to share his thoughts 2 years later after our initial conference with you. Thank you. CJ, welcome.
Well, it's great to be back at the Baker Institute. Let me just start by giving my usual disclaimer that when I talk at these things, I do so in my personal capacity. It means I can make last-minute revisions to my remarks without going back to the wardens in the corporate communications department. I very much like being here and I'm enthusiastic about this project. I will say that since the last time I was here, my family and I have moved from one Washington to the other. That's from the District of Columbia to the Seattle area. And I've learned a couple things about the Pacific Northwest. One is that nobody wears ties to work. And the other is that the weather, although gloomy a lot of the year, is terrific in September. That's all to say that it took a lot to convince me to travel away from Seattle at this time of year and to dig out my business attire from the outermost reaches of my closet. But consider that an indication of the regard that I have for the Baker Institute as well as for this project. In the past 8 years, we have witnessed a sea change in U.S. trade policy. It's been characterized by higher tariffs, more restrictive export controls, and the effective abandonment of traditional trade negotiations. But one of the most defining features of this new policy is bipartisan continuity. Donald Trump and Joe Biden may not enjoy each other's company on a debate stage, but when the history of this period is written, they will be forever bonded by what I will argue is a common Trump-Biden trade policy. With the election less than 50 days away and early voting set to begin soon in many states, this is an apt moment to reflect on that policy and the big questions that will confront U.S. policymakers in the next administration. I would argue that the start of the current moment in trade policy began on October the 7th of 2015. That is a date that is perhaps little noted nor long remembered, but it was consequential. It was the date when Hillary Clinton, preparing for her second run for the presidency in 2016, announced her opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. TPP, of course, had been negotiated by the administration in which she had served as Secretary of State. A mere 2 years earlier, she had called it the gold standard in U.S. trade negotiations. In the ensuing years, the Obama administration made TPP its top foreign policy priority. It was to be the fulcrum of what President Obama called a pivot to Asia. But the political road to TPP's adoption in the United States proved too difficult for the Obama administration to travel. It started with a revolt on the left by progressives and labor. The Obama administration was successful in pushing Trade Promotion Authority in 2015, which was seen as a test vote for TPP, but it was a Pyrrhic victory if there ever was one. While TPA ultimately passed, it doomed the broader cause of TPP and poisoned the well for future trade agreements. Now, of course, no retelling of the political history of this time can be complete without a mention of Donald J. Trump's descent from the escalators in Trump Tower in the spring of 2015. Trump's insurgent campaign for the GOP nomination was in large part an assault on free trade and open immigration, two fundamental precepts of the establishment party of the time, led by the likes of Paul Ryan. And on both points, he ground the establishment into the dust. The fact that the nominees of both political parties in 2016 broke so dramatically with party elites on trade policy was a sign of the times. Some view this as a regrettable populist overreaction to the natural pains of globalization. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, I think it also reflects a genuine failure by policymakers to understand and grapple with the downsides of globalization. Starting in 2013, the MIT economist David Autor and his co-authors David Dorn and Gordon Hanson published a series of papers on the so-called China shock. This research challenged pre-existing consensus in the economics profession that the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States was caused primarily by automation and not trade, and that unemployment was transitory for the affected workers. The China shock research found that the sharp rise of imports from China to the United States after China's accession to the WTO caused not only significant job losses, but sustained unemployment in manufacturing-dependent communities. Estimates of the job losses vary, but the human toll was undeniable. The economists Angus Deaton and Ann Case later found that this period overlapped with a spike in so-called deaths of despair, alcohol-related deaths, fatal drug overdoses, and suicides in many of the same communities most affected by the China shock. Now, none of this makes the case against trade, but it does make the case that policymakers in both parties failed to prepare American workers for globalization. Add to that growing concerns about the fragility of supply chains that arose during the pandemic, as well as concerns about the ability of adversaries of the United States to weaponize those supply chains. And it seems clear in retrospect that a reset in U.S. trade policy was not only inevitable, but to some extent necessary. When Trump was elected, he proceeded to implement the trade platform he had campaigned on. USTR implemented a sweeping Section 301 investigation of forced technology transfer practices in China. It resulted in the imposition of tariffs on over half of Chinese exports to the United States. Trump threatened to withdraw from NAFTA. The result was a renegotiated NAFTA and USMCA. He refused to appoint new panelists to the WTO appellate body, effectively killing that institution. He imposed stiff export controls against Huawei and other Chinese companies, as well as global tariffs on steel and aluminum against friend and foe alike. In the 2020 elections, Joe Biden said very little about trade, aside from some passing criticisms of the China tariffs. Yet after he was elected, many thought a reversion to the old trade policy would follow. He appointed a PhD economist with quite conventional trade views as his Secretary of State. There was much talk of a stabilization of U.S.-China relations. But a funny thing happened on the way back to the trade policies of the 1990s. President Biden embraced the trade policy of his predecessor. Trump-era export controls on Huawei and other Chinese companies were supplemented with controls on the export of advanced semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. After a review of the Section 301 tariffs, the Biden administration announced plans not only to retain them, but to quadruple tariffs for certain lines like electric vehicles. Biden adjusted the steel tariffs but didn't abandon them, and he continued the blockade on WTO judges. Now, of course, there were some differences between the Biden and Trump approaches to trade. The Biden administration was more apt to announce changes in policy in genteel press conferences rather than incendiary early morning tweets. But the goals were largely the same: to stimulate domestic manufacturing, even if that meant protecting the U.S. market and angering trade partners. Now, having covered the past and the present, let me now turn to the future. I see three critical questions regarding the fate of our most important trading relationships: the U.S. trading relationship with its North American counterparts, Mexico and Canada, the U.S.-EU relationship, and of course the U.S.-China relationship. Let me take each in turn, starting with North America and USMCA. As Tony mentioned, USMCA is up for renewal in the summer of 2026. Unlike prior trade agreements, USMCA has a fixed term of 16 years. But at the 6-year anniversary mark, the parties have the opportunity to extend the agreement for another 16 years. If they fail to do so, by July of 2026, a 10-year clock will start to run toward the eventual termination of the agreement. The idea behind this provision, which I maintain was a sound one, was to create an incentive for policymakers to continue to upgrade the agreement periodically so that we never find ourselves again in a situation like we were in 2017 with an agreement that was badly outdated and politically unpopular. I wrote an article 2 years ago urging policymakers to prepare for the renegotiation then, arguing that it would be here before we knew it. No one followed my advice. and I don't suspect that this subject will receive much attention by the White House in 2025, regardless of who is elected. Next year will be dominated by domestic issues, mainly taxing and spending. I therefore expect that a year from today, the negotiating agenda for the United States will be unsettled and the fate of USMCA uncertain. My best guess is that the chances for an immediate renewal are quite low. Mexico and Canada, which are heavily dependent on trade with the United States, would renew the agreement tomorrow, preferably with no changes. But from the U.S. perspective, the cost of not renewing the agreement at the 6-year anniversary mark are relatively low. The agreement would still have 10 years to run. U.S. leverage in the negotiations arguably would increase rather than decrease during that period. Yet for both a President Harris and a President Trump, the political costs of renewal would be non-trivial. The passage of USMCA was, in my view, one of the great political hat tricks of recent years, and I say that not just because I was involved in it. But name the last time that the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, the Steelworkers, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, the Farm Bureau, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump agreed on something. It was USMCA. Unfortunately, I don't see that same political constellation of stars aligning anytime soon. Let's start with labor. It's hard for me to envision a scenario in which organized labor supports an immediate renewal of USMCA in 2026. There's been considerable progress by Mexico in implementing its labor reforms, and USTR has been quite active in using the rapid response mechanism to crack down on abuses at particular facilities. But if you look at the recent reports of the Labor Advisory Committee Congress set up to monitor implementation of the labor chapter, you'll find several complaints about continued violence against labor organizers in Mexico, lack of funding for Mexico's labor institutions, and the continued dominance of the so-called protection unions. During the USMCA negotiations, we were able to get the major U.S. labor unions on board because we were able to argue that the agreement was an upgrade from the status quo. That argument won't be available the next time around. I suspect that the unions will say that Mexico should implement its labor reforms first, and we can talk about renewal later. I also suspect that while the business community will want the agreement renewed, support will be somewhat tepid. The business community is concerned about Mexico's rollback of its energy reforms, as well as recent attempts to politicize the judiciary. So if I'm right, we are headed towards an anticlimax in the summer of 2026. The parties will miss the renewal date, at which point a slow clock towards the theoretical termination of the agreement will start to run. Now, what could change the dynamics? I can think of a couple things. One is the attitude that Mexico and Canada take to the negotiations. Now, for those in this room, and I know there are several who have been involved in trade negotiations, you'll know that the typical playbook is for the parties to take very extreme positions at the beginning and hold all concessions to the end. I would suggest to my friends in Mexico and Canada that that would be an unwise strategy in this instance. The biggest challenge that Mexico and Canada will face in urging a swift renewal will be getting the attention of the next administration. An indication to move in the U.S. direction early on issues like energy, labor, dairy, auto rules of origin just might grab the attention of the White House. This is an unusual approach, but unique times call for novel strategies. The second way to break the impasse would be if the next administration sees USMCA as a way to reset U.S. trade policy generally. That could be done by expanding the scope of the agreement to strengthen the critical minerals supply chain in North America, adding new disciplines on AI governance, export controls, and inbound investment restrictions, and perhaps most intriguingly, opening the door to new members of USMCA. The two most promising candidates, in my view, would be Australia and the United Kingdom. Think of it as a merger of USMCA and AUKUS. We would need to work on the acronym. But it would allow the United States to bring its closest security and economic partners together under a common umbrella. In time, this bloc might use its combined leverage to negotiate with other techno-democracies like Japan, India, and the EU. One might see this perhaps as the start of a new global trading system, at least one for the US and its allies, that could eventually take over or at least supplant the WTO. This vision might strike one as far-fetched, but I think that outside-of-the-box thinking will be necessary if we have any hope of an immediate or even near-term renewal of USMCA. Now, the second big question in trade policy for the next administration will be the fate of the US-EU trading relationship. Now, I would argue that the EU-US relationship on trade is akin to a sibling rivalry or perhaps even a dysfunctional marriage. From an economic perspective, the relationship is hugely consequential for both. but it is beset by decades of bitter resentments, irritants, and insecurities that have prevented progress on a common trade and economic agenda. The Obama administration tried to move the relationship forward with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which failed. The Trump administration obviously tried a more confrontational approach with, let's say, modest results. The Biden administration tried conciliation. It negotiated a tariff rate quota on steel and aluminum, which allowed the EU to drop its retaliatory tariffs against the United States. But its attempt to negotiate a lasting global steel arrangement foundered because of EU concerns about WTO compliance. Brussels and Washington launched a dialogue on trade and technology. It was a forum for polite conversation, but little else. In fact, when it came to promoting the interests of U.S. manufacturing, the EU found that President Biden was as unapologetic as his predecessor. Some European friends have even told me in jest that the Biden administration's approach to the transatlantic economic relationship is best described as America first with better manners. So can this marriage be saved? Well, I don't think that we're headed for a divorce anytime soon, but absent a change of hearts or circumstances, I think this will be a story of unhappily ever after. I do see a glimmer of hope, however, in the recent report that was issued on the competitiveness of the European economy at the behest of the Commission by former Italian Prime Minister and European Central Bank President Mario Draghi. In it, Draghi laid out a devastating indictment of European economic performance in recent years relative to the United States, and he called for a more flexible and pragmatic approach to trade policy. He recognized, for example, that the EU has no hope of displacing the large U.S. technology companies in cloud computing, and he called for a transatlantic digital marketplace which would ensure U.S. and European companies have access to markets on both sides of the ocean. I now turn from the Atlantic to the Pacific and to my third question. What's in store for the U.S. trade relationship with China? This is another area that has been marked by remarkable policy continuity between the Biden and Trump administrations. Due to tariffs and other measures, China's share of overall U.S. imports is declining rapidly. At the same time, we've seen China double down on the very policies that caused the U.S.-China trade relationship to reach a boiling point in the first place. As China's economy has faltered in the wake of a slow-motion real estate meltdown, the Chinese government has rejected the advice of most economists that it should take steps to stimulate consumer demand. Instead, it has put all its chips on export-led growth. This has stoked fears of a second China shock not only in the United States but throughout the world. I would submit, however, that the most consequential competition between the United States and China in the coming years will not be in the area of manufactured goods or even in the area of security, but in technology. The arrival of ChatGPT in the fall of 2022 ushered in a new era of AI innovation. At present, the United States is in the lead. We have the most powerful chips and the most powerful models. But the lead is tenuous. While the U.S. still leads in proprietary models, for example, Chinese open source models have already caught up with their U.S. competitors. Huawei will soon begin mass production of a new AI chip, which is less powerful than NVIDIA's high-end chips, but sufficient for most AI workloads. The new Huawei chip also uses less energy, which means that more chips can be deployed in a given data center to increase overall compute capacity. To date, the U.S. government's focus has been on protecting AI and semiconductor technology through export controls. There's certainly a role for export controls in this space, but it's also important that the U.S. focus on expanding the boundaries of its own tech ecosystem. Whether the AI economy in the rest of the world, although some degree of tech decoupling between the United States and China perhaps is inevitable, what happens in the rest of the world and whether the rest of the world's AI economy will rest on a U.S. or a Chinese tech stack is yet to be determined. While the U.S. reigns in the cloud markets in the industrialized world, Chinese companies like Huawei, Baidu, and Alibaba dominate technology in the global south, where most of the world's population growth will come from in the coming decades. When it comes to competition with China, I hope that the next administration will think not only about tariffs and export controls, but also development finance and agreements with third parties to facilitate the swift diffusion of trusted U.S. technology. Which country's tech stack dominates the AI economy of the future is perhaps one of the most consequential questions in economic policy going forward. It deserves the attention of trade policymakers. So in short, if current trends continue, I expect that relations between the United States and its trading partners at best will be static. And I realize that that might seem a pessimistic message to convey on this late summer morning. But it's also important to remember that there's a difference between the state of U.S. trade policy and the state of U.S. trade. There are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about the latter. America is still a great trading nation. Trade patterns have shifted away from China and towards Mexico and other countries, but trade is up and will remain so, regardless of what happens in the world of trade policy, and I venture, regardless of who wins the presidency. And for all the hand-wringing about deglobalization and the demise of the rules-based trading system, global trade barriers remain low by historic standards. Indeed, to some extent, trade policy is a victim of its own success. There's frankly not that much upside to be gained from incremental tariff reductions. To the extent trade policy inhibits trade these days, it's because of deep-seated disagreements about the role of the state in economic affairs, different philosophical approaches to regulation, and conflicting security interests. Yet despite all of this, the U.S. continues to outpace all of our major competitors. American companies are thriving in the international marketplace, particularly in cutting-edge technology. In some ways, the biggest barrier to new trade agreements is perhaps the absence of a genuine crisis that would focus the minds of policymakers and create the conditions for compromise. If a crisis is what's required, I'll gladly take stasis instead. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. If you were going to advise a new administration next year, and they said to you, in your view and your experience, what is the most effective way for the United States to use tariffs? What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong?
Well, it's a good question. I think you've got to step back and think what are the possible goals of using tariffs? And I think that there are a few. I mean, one would be to raise revenue. Traditionally that was a big source of revenue for the federal government. I mean, today, given the size of the federal government and the size of trade, will never be a leading source of revenue. But in theory, you could do that. A second goal might be to create incentives for manufacturing in the United States by making imports less competitive in our market. A third would be to gain leverage over trading partners that you could then use to launch trade negotiations and hope for better market access for U.S. goods in those markets. I mean, the issue is that in order to optimize for any one of those goals, you would be de-optimizing for the others. So, for example, if you wanted to raise revenue, what you would probably want is a tariff that is low enough so that it doesn't really change trade patterns and you generate the maximum amount of revenue. But if you did that, you wouldn't be creating incentives for investment. You probably, if it's low, you probably aren't going to have that much additional leverage in trade negotiations. If what you're trying to do is to protect the domestic market, what you're really trying to do over the long run is to try to change trade patterns. So the goal would be to reduce imports. That, of course, would reduce tariff revenue. And it would mean that you're not trying to open up markets, you're trying to protect the U.S. market, so that goes against would go against the goal of leverage. So I think the first thing you need to do is decide what is it that you want to achieve. And then you would craft your tariff policy around that. I also just think that as you think about tariffs, to some extent, I think this conversation plays out on the extremes and is unhelpful. I mean, my view is that this isn't religion. Tariffs, I mean, particularly tariffs on items that you want to have in the United States, you want to produce in the United States, or you want to divert trade from certain places for national security reasons. I think that can make some sense. But you also have to look very carefully at the dynamics of these particular markets. If it's something like tennis shoes, like I don't even think that 100 or a 200% tariff is going to bring that production back to the United States. It means you're not going to have domestic competitors. And in those instances, the chances of the cost just being passed on to consumers are a lot higher. If you look at something like the steel industry, where you have a lot of excess capacity in the United States, you put tariffs on steel, U.S. companies can step into and fill the void, and prices will normalize over a period of time. So I think it's all just, I think it's a complicated issue. My two pieces of advice: first, figure out exactly what you want to do, and secondly, devise a tariff policy that responds to the dynamics of particular markets. Which unfortunately doesn't make a very good campaign slogan, but I think that's a reality.
Hello. You seem negative about the future of NAFTA. But it's hard for me to imagine that the auto industry in the United States would want that to disappear, since I would believe that if it hadn't been for NAFTA, the U.S. automobile industry might really have disappeared. So how do you take that issue in light of your thoughts about the future of USMCA?
Well, two points that I very much agree with. The U.S. auto industry does not want USMCA to go away, and I also agree that in light of competition from China in particular, if we did not have an integrated North American auto supply chain, I think we'd be less competitive than we otherwise would be. So I agree with both of those points. The point I was making about renewal, though, is what will happen in 2026. Because in 2026, that is when the parties will first have the opportunity to renew for another 16 years. If they fail to renew in July of 2026, the agreement doesn't disappear. It still has a lifespan of 10 years. So my point is just I think that the political incentives for either administration to agree to an immediate renewal in 2026 are quite low. Now, they're low precisely because nothing will happen for 10 years. The U.S. can decide at any point in that 10 years that it can re-up the agreement. I mean, imagine if President Harris is in office, she's going to be thinking about re-election, she's going to be thinking about keeping the labor unions happy. Why would she renew immediately as opposed to waiting until after what she hopes is her successful election campaign in 4 years? President Trump is going to want to be paid for that. I think the inclination to just renew for the sake of promoting good feelings in Mexico and Canada will be quite low. So that's my reason. I think ultimately by 2036 we'd work something out, but it's not clear to me that there's a natural point to work something out in those 10 years. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree, and that's why I really think that Mexico and Canada need to be careful. They need to think very carefully about how they approach these negotiations and just not fall into old patterns. Because while the consequences for the U.S. of failing to agree to an immediate renewal are low, at least in the short term, I think that they are a lot higher for Mexico and Canada. And as I said, unfortunately, the way that this is designed, and it's always these things are the product of negotiations. But I mean, one flaw I would say in this mechanism, might be that actually the 10-year period is so long, and there's no natural point within the 10 years where a decision would be made. And we all just know that if politicians are dealing with a problem that isn't going to materialize for 10 years, the chances of them dealing with it in the near term are quite low. So again, there's a need for creative thinking, I think, particularly as Mexico and Canada think about their negotiating position.
In your comments regarding China, your focus was around U.S. tariffs and restrictions and the Chinese government's focus or lack of focus on their own consumer economy and around exports. But you didn't comment at all regarding the restrictive policies that the Chinese government has put in place, particularly in the technology sector, but in others. The whole succession of China first policies, both publicly announced and the ones that are supposedly soft announced that were published to Chinese economic leaders. And it's driven, as we've seen, waves of disinvestment and even exiting by companies participating in the Chinese economy.
That's absolutely right. I actually think that people focus on the size of the trade deficit and the overall trade volumes. I think that the investment flows are really the most telling indicator of what's happening in the U.S.-China relationship, and that is all pointing to some form of decoupling. I do think that the Chinese have somewhat of a schizophrenic policy, though, when it comes to foreign investment, because while there is a drive towards self-sufficiency, towards these new productive forces, as President Xi calls them, and making sure that China is less dependent on the U.S. in technology. At the same time, China still wants investment from foreign companies. It realizes that in the AI race that U.S. companies are ahead. And I think we sometimes tend to think that China has a monolithic policy on everything, and the reality is that there's not one China when it comes to these issues. Different ministries have different perspectives. So I expect that will continue to be the case. I mean, the real question will be, I think that the state of chip manufacturing in China is really the key question, because that is one place where China needs access to Western technology. If that link is severed and China is truly sufficient in chips, I think it would have more flexibility to effectuate a more complete tech decoupling.
When China joined the WTO, one of the crucial components was that Congress passed a statute giving China permanent normal trade relations. So prior to that, Congress voted each year as to whether China would be treated like everybody else, but they made it permanent in 2000. And recently, there's been a number of pieces of legislation proposed to withdraw permanent normal trade relations. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether you thought we're likely to see that kind of legislation passed, and whether you think it would be a good idea, a good policy.
On the politics of it, I don't know. I mean, generally, if you're asking the question, is Congress going to pass anything? The best bet is no, because Congress is kind of the most complex collective action problem that exists. I mean, to some extent, I think though that I find the debate on this a little curious, because we've effectively already withdrawn what used to be called most favored nation status for China. We have both administrations have the Trump administration first imposed, and then the Biden administration doubled down on these tariffs. So we have what would withdrawal from withdrawing PNTR mean? It would mean that, in theory, we would be free to increase tariffs on China, change the tariff schedule. We've already done that. So, I mean, the question that I would ask is then, what is the goal that you want to achieve in withdrawing PNTR? Now, one goal would be that it would signal to U.S. business that that these tariffs are not there for leverage. They will be there forever. This is not a transitory policy. I think that, at least at this point, I maybe wouldn't have said this a few years ago, but at this point, I think that U.S. business, by and large, understands the realities of the situation and is taking appropriate steps to align its practices with the interests of the United States. It certainly would cause symbolically, it would be a big deal. The Chinese would react to it. So, as with a lot of these things, I would urge policymakers to just step back and think, what is the real goal here, and what are the best ways to achieve it?
I'm going to take a few more minutes because there's a lot of questions. But we're running out of time, so I'm going to take them all together. I'm going to ask CJ to stay with us another 5 minutes.
All right.
And maybe,
hey, thank you very much.
Maybe write them down and then address them together. So I'll walk around, give you the microphone. Be as quick as you can. But let me add the first here. Mexico is also in a protectionist state, and I think making very strategic mistakes about its energy sector, its alliances with countries that are very questionable to the United States. Its failure to implement certain aspects of the agreement, a more protectionist approach with lithium and things like that. I think this is pretty much Mexico running headlong into a wall. Does that put the review and revisions at risk? And what can Mexico really do, the next administration, which will take office in about 10 days, to really change policy and sort of create the conditions for a renewal, or at least for the agreement to survive? Real quick, David, and then you.
Going back to the 2026 review, you made a very good point, it seems to me, that not only Harris, but if Trump were president with an election coming up, a congressional election coming up, they'd much rather kick the ball downstream. Under the, whatever it is, 34.7, if the review doesn't result in an extension in 2026, isn't there going to be another review in 2027 and 2028? Doesn't that give the U.S. an enormous amount of flexibility in deciding when it wants to do this, unless there's something so critical about what's happening in Mexico that they would move immediately?
Very quickly, you mentioned new areas of development like AI. What will be your thoughts in terms of what the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, or other, other countries will develop and put in paper in terms of this area, considering that many countries are not developers and use this technology for all around the or other parts of the world.
Thank you. Yeah, real quick.
You mentioned the rhetoric of the two major candidates running for political office. What do we know of the advisors behind the candidates who will actually be implementing policy if each candidate is elected for office?
Thank you. Here, real quick. Thank you.
You've mentioned about the AI being the next battlefield, maybe for U.S. and China in the next coming years. And we know that when it comes to AI framework, developing AI framework, China has been rolling out fast and very detailed AI frameworks over the past few years. What would you say will be the next step for the U.S. To not lag behind in terms of AI frameworks and AI development? Should we be open to the possibility of examining the frameworks of other countries and China too?
Okay. Two more real quick, and then we'll give CJ the last word. Yes, sir.
Well, a couple have already touched on my question, but I'm interested in solar on the across the board. China, the U.S., Mexico, a number of people are trying to come up with reasonable, reliable solar. One of the students right here in Rice about 10 years ago come up with a huge move forward in it. What's your position on that in the way of restrictions? Tariffs are really not beneficial from my point of view in that. So I'm curious what yours is.
Thank you. Here, last.
Good morning. Considering that current government of Mexico, as has been said here, has taken awful decisions in many areas of policy, and that the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, will most likely follow most of these policies, do you foresee that next administration will have a different approach with the Mexican government, considering also that migration has been the key element for President Lopez Obrador in the negotiations with the United States, and that has maybe at some point stopped the United States in pressuring more the Mexican government?
Okay. Go ahead, real quick.
I guess I know the topic of this panel is the future of U.S. trade policy, but given, for instance, Germany's just reinstitution of land borders, somewhat in violation of Schengen area protocols, how would you create a Western-oriented and a politically persuasive and politically possible argument in favor of multilateralism rather than bilateral negotiations that seem to be kind of the flavor of the day?
This is putting your synthetic skills to the test, CJ.
Yeah,
but,
all right.
bunch
Well,
of questions.
fortunately, unlike ChatGPT, I won't be able to just regurgitate an answer, but maybe it'll flow a little better. So I'll try to group these a little bit. Let me just start with Mexico. So a couple questions about Mexico's increasing protectionist tendencies, and then what will be the approach of the next U.S. administration towards Mexico. Mexico has a golden opportunity right now to cement its role as a manufacturing partner of the United States. Every company that has supply chains in Asia would love to relocate to Mexico. And really, there's a problem with there's just not enough capacity, and there are infrastructure problems. There are obviously problems with the rule of law. It is unfortunate in my view that. This moment has coincided with, let's just say, some political upheaval and instability in Mexico. I think that President Sheinbaum has an opportunity to change course and to work constructively with the next administration. In some ways, I wonder if the 2026 negotiation might be an opportunity, an excuse for her to effectuate a pivot, because it is an external event. She could say that we have to do this in order to renew USMCA, and that's more important than maybe adherence to some of the political commitments that we've made domestically. So that's an opportunity. I think that the next couple of years will be a real test of, obviously there will be her first few years in office, but it'll be a real. We'll see what kind of a leader she is. I think she has a great opportunity, but the stakes are enormously high. And in terms of the next, the next U.S. administration's approach, I mean, obviously the migration issue will be, will be foremost in the mind of the Trump administration. Although I imagine that, even a Harris administration now too. I mean, if you look at, the change, at least in the way that Vice President Harris has talked about this issue, I think she understands the political sensitivity of it. As with a lot of things, it is one of the kind of themes of my speech. I'm not so sure that the approach of either Harris or Trump at the end of the day is going to be all that different. What will be different is the rhetoric and maybe the tolerance for brinksmanship. But this is one of these relationships. It's vital for both the U.S. and Mexico. They need to figure out a way through it. I mean, David, to your question about the 2026 review, I agree with you that there is, because the mechanism calls for an annual review in the event that the parties do not renew, that does give the U.S. a great deal of flexibility. However, I think that we could very easily see the annual review period just be kind of being an ongoing dialogue. It won't be a real forcing function in the way that frankly, in the way that the first trigger point of 6 years is. But I think the fact that the U.S. continues to have so much flexibility is another reason why it decreases the incentives for the next president to agree to an immediate renewal, because you've got so much flexibility. I mean, it can be for President Trump. He could decide this is something that my successor could deal with. Certainly pivot until after the midterm elections. President Harris, something she could deal with in a second term. So I think that the incentives to act quickly are quite low. And I just, if there's one message that I would convey to my friends in Mexico and Canada, it's to understand that political reality. With regard to AI, what we can do with AI in North America, as well as this question about the AI frameworks in China and with what the U.S. can do, I believe strongly that we're at a point in tech regulation where the absence of tech regulation in the U.S. is actually a competitive disadvantage for our companies. Because what that means is that the U.S. does not have a benchmark. First of all, we are just sort of assumed to be completely unregulated and of operating in the Wild West, which undermines trust in U.S. tech companies. It also just means that the U.S. doesn't have a starting point for real negotiations, for example, with the European Union. So I think it is important for the U.S. to have its own a reasonable AI framework, and I think we have to go slow as any technology is developing. There's certainly a risk that you could over-regulate in the beginning. But I think that it's important to do that. And ultimately, the risk for the U.S. tech sector in AI in particular is that we would have to comply with different frameworks in different parts of the world. The optimal state for us would be an interoperable framework, at least between the large advanced democracies in the world. And that's why I suggest actually that I think that the 2026 renewal, although fraught, I think doesn't offer an opportunity to do that. I think it would be, frankly, pretty easy to get the US, Mexico, and Canada all on the same page about what an AI governance framework could look like. You could then have that as a precedent. That could then be used as a baseline to bring other countries to the table. Again, I would start with Australia and the United Kingdom, and then go to Japan, and kind of try to build out from there. And this question about how would you go about recreating a different world trading system? I think the idea of a multilateral trading system that includes that has a membership that is akin to that of the WTO in the world in which we live, given the security realities, I just think that there are real limits to that. That's why my preference would be not multilateral or purely bilateral, but to look at something that's plurilateral. I mean, my own view is that the United States and its close security partners, not only are security interests aligned, I think our economic interests, viewed in the correct light, are aligned as well. We don't have the same concerns about offshoring of jobs when we're talking about France and Germany that we do. And we have other problems with those countries from a trade perspective. But I just think, rationally speaking, it makes sense for there to be a trade bloc of, again, what I would call the advanced techno-democracies. I'd like to see us head towards something like that. I don't underestimate the difficulties of that. I mean, this might be something that would be a decades-long project. Again, though, I think an opportunity for us to move in that direction would be the renegotiation of USMCA and potentially adding other trade partners to the mix. Just ticking down my list here. Let me go to the question of solar. I think solar is a really interesting question in trade because on the one hand, this was an industry that was created in the United States, and it was and it's basically, at least the manufacturing of solar panels and cells was created here, and it's basically just been completely destroyed and undercut. But then there's a question of what do you do with that, and is it worth trying to revive that, or should we focus on something else? I mean, certainly and this is another place where goals conflict. I mean, if your goal is to stimulate domestic manufacturing, you would pursue one set of policies. If your goal is to decarbonize and to increase the proliferation of solar power in the United States and in North America, you'd move in the other direction. I will say just generally, and it's a complicated issue. I'm going to dodge it to some extent, and not take a firm position. But I would say that I think we have to, think about what is it that what industries do we want to reshore, and where are places where we are comfortable relying on supply chains that run in other parts of, and there's where are you comfortable? What things need to be in the United States versus what things are we comfortable being in North America versus what things are we comfortable being with allies, and what things are we comfortable even having things in China. I think there will be different products that will be in those categories. Where solar fits is I could kind of make the argument in both ways. I could argue that we need to have some domestic manufacturing capacity. Do you need to have 100%? Maybe not. Again, there's certain consumer goods I would argue should not be the focus of reshoring, but then there are, for advanced manufacturing, critical minerals and other things, I think that there are really legitimate economic and security reasons to have those things closer to home. And then finally on the, I think I'm doing my inventory here, I think I have one more, which is the question about who will be advising either president on trade policy. A good question. Let me start with President Trump, and obviously I think one of the voices would be my old boss, Bob Lighthizer, who I think is a very smart, accomplished guy, very strong views, but also somebody who is I think the private sector found was quite reasonable, could be swayed by facts and arguments, and I think overall was a steadying presence in the last administration. He will be there. I would assume. I certainly would urge President Trump to consider him for a very important position in the next administration. Obviously, though, in the last administration there were different voices. There was Secretary Mnuchin, who had more of a classic kind of private sector, Wall Street perspective on these issues. There were others who had more populist voices. It's also the case that President Trump won't be able to run for re-election again, so he will have a freer hand in trade policy, which perhaps means that there will be opportunities to be. Perhaps he will feel more empowered to take even. He took some pretty bold moves the last time around. He might feel even more empowered this time around. At the same time, though, I think if you look at the reality of how the Trump administration worked, there was sometimes a difference between the rhetoric and the actual substance of the policies, and there was a certain amount, I think, in the way that President Trump looks about these things. I think he's always kind of negotiating and always kind of trying to figure out how far he can push things. So I would caution against thinking that there won't be big moves. I imagine that there will be, but I would also suggest that people sort of take a step back and think about how this will actually play out. I think that so predictions of catastrophe aren't necessarily the right way to look at it either. I mean, in terms of President Harris, I think it'd be really interesting because this is not an area where she has said very much. She doesn't have, as far as I know, a group of economic advisors around her who really think about international economic issues or are known for that in the same way that they think more about domestic issues. So I think it's a real question mark. I think that the realities of the moment and the politics will be such that I would be surprised if she makes moves on trade that are dramatically different than President Biden. But it will be a new cast of characters. It will also, though, be a first-term Democratic administration. And generally, history is has shown that in the first term, most Democratic administrations prefer to do very little on trade. It's a tough subject in the Democratic Party, given the makeup of the coalition. And so traditionally things like the Obama administration didn't do much on trade in the first term and then went all in on trade agreements, particularly in TPP and TTIP in the second term. So I wouldn't expect a lot in the short term, but over the long run, it's an open question. So thank you guys very much. This was a lot of fun.
I think we're ready to begin. We have a really exciting panel, obviously, on the upcoming North American, or rather USMCA Accord and its upcoming renewal. Although I think we'll touch on a number of issues. As I said, my name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico, and joining me here are Orlando Sanchez. I won't introduce everybody by a long introduction. I think it's we got to go into the conversation. Then we got Orlando Duran next, and then we got of course Meredith Lilly, who's coming from Ottawa, and then David Gantz, our Will Clayton Fellow on Trade and International Economics, and largely responsible for this program. So I'm going to ask each of them to share their thoughts with us for 7, 8, 9 minutes. Academics, time is flexible. And then we'll have a conversation and we'll take questions from you for us to continue our very interesting conversation of this morning. Meredith.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm joining you from Canada, and while everybody here knows that we have a new president about to assume office in Mexico, and there's an election on in the US, Canada will also be going to an election in the next year. And you'd be forgiven if you didn't know that. But we are anticipating a change election in Canada, and so that's kind of a third element to all of this that makes USMCA and its renewal kind of exciting times. So I do want to start on a positive note talking about USMCA, which is that after 4 years of implementation, USMCA is actually working quite well. I'm going to get into some of the things that aren't working so well, but trade is higher than ever between our countries, and if you think back to where things were at as we were renegotiating NAFTA to USMCA, there was a lot of questions about how this was going to work, and overall I think it's working quite well. But there are a few bumps in the road that need to be addressed, and that's normal when we're implementing a new trade agreement. For Canada, these are primarily in areas of the NAFTA renegotiation that were contentious. Rules of origin on autos, for example, and of course Canada's dairy concessions. We shouldn't be surprised that these are the things we're arguing about, because these are the things we've always been arguing about. Also, in the case of Canada, there are new concerns have emerged since USMCA was negotiated, and that's around Canada's very activist digital policy agenda. It has real trade consequences, and the Americans are not happy. And there has been the beginnings of a dispute launched against Canada in the area of our digital services tax. So what I'd like to do is talk about the review and what Canada is doing to prepare and where I think things will go from Canada's perspective, and then, time permitting, we'll talk a little bit about the disputes. So, the first thing, CJ set this up very well, talking about the review clause. We didn't have one of those in NAFTA. It was an ongoing agreement that would last forever. And so this review clause actually is less than a page of text in the overall agreement, yet it actually stands to potentially really jeopardize it, frankly. And so, as CJ outlined, if all three countries don't agree to renew the agreement in 2026, then we go into this period of annual reviews. I agree with him that I don't think we're going to see a renewal in 2026. There are absolutely zero reasons for politicians to do that. And so I do think we're going to be in a world of annual reviews every year for 10 years, and I think the ways that he's characterized it are actually quite accurate. But what I think is really problematic about that is that while that may suit the political interests of the United States, it's really not very good for business, and it's not good for private sector or foreign investment. They look for stability and certainty in their investment, and they look for this 5 to 10 years in advance. And the idea that we're going to play brinksmanship for 10 years into a potential either renegotiation or sunsetting of the agreement is frankly bad for NAFTA and bad for USMCA. So what do we need to do if we want to try and minimize the likelihood of going in that direction? The first thing I think is that we need to get officials working quickly on a process as soon as possible. And while CJ said that's not really happening in the US, and there's reasons I think around the electoral calendar that that's not occurring, but in Canada we've already started. We've already had a parliamentary study. We have consultations with stakeholders open now. So we're working on this. And in my view, ideally, the process should be scoped quite narrowly and not be pushing to move all of our current areas of disputes into the review. Instead, we should be working faster now. Now, one reason that I think there's some likelihood that we could be successful in this area is that we have no trade promotion authority in place in the United States right now. And so, and I think it's unlikely that a future president is going to be lobbying for trade promotion authority in the near future in the next presidency. And so if there's no trade promotion authority, you can't make too many changes to USMCA, certainly not in the area of market access. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So secondly, I think we need to be working on current irritants now. So, it's clear the United States is not going to abide by the rules of origin ruling and dispute settlement. I think there are actually good reasons for us to be thinking about rules of origin moving forward. The electric vehicle transition is really changing the way that we make cars. There's many fewer parts in electric vehicles, so there's good reasons that the three countries should be working now to talk about rules of origin trilaterally. I also think Canada needs to be addressing current irritants, including our digital services tax. We know from the current White House and from anyone that's going to occupy the White House next year that Canada's digital services tax is not going to be allowed to stand. And so I would encourage Canada to be moving on that now. There's also other irritants that just can't wait, like country of origin labeling on meat has come up again as an issue for Canada. The softwood lumber dispute continues to make housing contribute to the cost of high housing in the United States because of your tariff policies. So these are things that we really should be working on now. And then thirdly, I think that we need to be showing that dispute settlement decisions can work, that our dispute settlement system works. And I think it's a mixed bag when we look at the current USMCA record. So in my view, Canada has not been implementing the decisions on dairy in good faith, and that's something that we should do. I agree with the point that CJ raised that it would behoove Canada and Mexico to abide by rulings rather than working towards running out the clock, because I think in this case that will backfire. Canada's also watching the GMO case on corn with Mexico very closely, both because we care a lot about our own GMO agricultural exports in the North American space, but also because we worry about these kinds of precedents with our trade with Europe. GMO is a big issue for Canada. So, and then I just want to say two other things before I stop, and these are general points. So one is that I think we're increasingly going to see linkages between Canada-US trading relationship and the broader challenges with our bilateral relationship. And so Canada has been a real laggard on fulfilling our NATO 2% spending commitments. I suspect some in the room are aware of that. I'm certainly aware of that. Our business community is aware of that. Our politicians are aware of that. Yet we continue to not fulfill our requirements. And I think that increasingly we're going to see linkages in this space and that it's going to be a barrier to trade for us. Secondly, I think we're going to see broader challenges around trusted supply chains and competition with China, particularly things like EVs and AI and security-sensitive products. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot more impact on both Mexico and Canada around our own trade with China and how that intersects with our trade with the United States. And increasingly, I think we're looking at kind of big picture bilateral foreign policy issues that are inserting into the USMCA relationship.
Thank you. Orlando.
Okay, I hope that you can hear me. And first of all, thank you. And it's an honor for me to participate in this lecture related to the future of trade policy in the US. I am deeply grateful to the Rice University and the Baker Institute of Public Policy for the invitation, and Tony Payan for all their generosity and in allowing me to participate. My name is Orlando Perez. I was working in the Ministry of Economy for many years. I was a former trade negotiator in the USMCA, including the state-owned enterprises and intellectual property chapter. And I was the lead counsel for trade negotiations and trade disputes and investment disputes in the Ministry of Economy. And for more than 25 years, I have been involved and have reviewed closely the trade policy in Mexico and the deep influence of the NAFTA and the US and Canadian policy vis-a-vis what Mexico has done during the 90s, 20s, and during the last years. So why is trade policy adopted by the US important for Mexico? I will say for two main reasons. One, the US is Mexico's main trading partner and vice versa, and the USMCA and the US and Canada's demand for Mexico to comply with those commitments in a letter and in a spirit serve as a counterbalance to nationalist policies, and apparently the only remaining counterbalance together with what the private sector or the industries may pursue with respect to Mexico's own policies. The business community, industries, the academia have a clear role in knowing the benefits of the USMCA. The agreement intends to create legal certainty in the economic operations, and the government must abide by those rules. Therefore, for me, it seems to me that the direction taken by the US in the future, in the near future, and the current provisions of the USMCA provides an optical checkpoint against the actions that another government intends to implement. So I will divide my brief remarks, I think, in three main areas. One, we already have heard that has a huge increase in protection policies globally, also in the North American region, and in particularly in Mexico, what we have seen is an increase of nationalist policies. During the last 6 years, all the policies has been oriented on what happened internally. Mexico has been very vocal to recognize the relevance of the USMCA as an international treaty, as a framework for cooperation in terms of economic and the relationship with Canada and Mexico. But we know, or many of us know, that these nationalist policies will have an impact in the trade relationship with the US, Canada, and other trading partners. As you have heard, during the last months has been pushing some structural constitutional reforms that may impact the investment and business environment in Mexico. Private sector with trade and investment operations in Mexico must be vigilant and demand that such modifications do not generate possible violations of trade agreements such as the USMCA. The second point that I want to raise is we perceive that there is a selective compliance by the three USMCA parties to certain obligations and a reluctance to implement the decisions resulting from Chapter 31 from the dispute settlement proceeding, as was mentioned by Meredith. I fully agree with that remarks. And the third point is that, at least in the point of view of Mexico, the process of the review of the agreement in 2026 is very relevant inflection point, as was called by the lead of the USTR, and provides an opportunity for the USMCA parties to review the degree of compliance of their own obligations and probably to take the necessary steps to maintain the agreement in force. I don't know, perhaps the perception in Mexico is that the process, it will be tough, but there is good expectation that the agreement continues in place because it's relevant in terms of create certainty in business. As was mentioned by Meredith, and I fully agree on the point of view of the industries, they perceive that every time that someone says, well, the agreement will die in 10 years, in 8 years, in 5 years, it creates a lot of negative noise, and the decision to make investments for a long terms could be stopped if the business community start hearing every time that the agreement has a bumpy period of time where they were not aware if the agreement will continue in place or not. So, as was mentioned, the U.S. right now is the main trading partner for Mexico, and Mexico is the main trading partner of the U.S. If we see the latest Census Bureau figures, the U.S. goods trade deficit with Mexico in June 2000, during all 2023, around $152 billion. Obviously, we know that existing of a trade deficit could be sometimes positive from one partners, but sometimes it creates or raise questions to other partners. So we need to be also vigilant that this current trade does not create any problems, but I think that is something positive in terms that we see a lot of trade from the entry into force of the USMCA, and in the case of investment, the investment has continued growing up in Mexico. So it's a pretty unique situation that you have investment, that trade continues to grow, but at the same time, there are some policies that should not be very consistent with, or the potential that Mexico could have in terms of the agreement. So returning to the first point, as you have saw in Mexico, the federal executive has promoted a series of constitutional reforms in various areas, and I think that this has created a lot of perhaps some noise globally. Recently, the Congress approved a structural reform to the judiciary that calls into question the impartiality and independence of judges. I think that the main issue or the main task for the new or the upcoming administration is to secure that impartiality and independence continue be in place for judges. Probably you will hear that part of these reforms includes the election by vote of the judge at state level, at federal level, including justice of the Supreme Court. Currently, the justice of the Supreme Court are 11, now has been reduced to 9. We will have 2 big elections for the judges, one in 2025, the half of the judges, and the other in 2027. Previously, the judges at federal level and magistrates were elected by a professional exam career, but now it will be elected by public vote. So obviously this creates a lot of tensions. Internally has been a lot of criticism about this reform, but I think that the main task or the main challenge to the government is to secure that all the judges, all the judiciary maintains independence and impartial in terms to provide their decisions. So it's a very tough issue. And returning to the protectionist measures, obviously Mexico has still maintaining the same energy policies and has strong views in terms of regulate genetically modified corn. At the same time of this reform, it has been put in a constitution a complete ban of genetically modified corn in terms of use, importation, and commercialization. So I think that this is also not positive if we have a case ongoing and at the same time you put constitutional reform that has been or that will be approved by the Congress. But that are part of the challenges that Mexico is facing, and I think that, as I mentioned, the counterbalance of the USMCA and the trade policy promoted by the US and Canada will help to take proper decisions in the near future. Secondly, I think that other element that is in the air, at least in Mexico, is that sometimes not only Mexico perhaps fails in comply with some commitments. There is a space of doubt of whether the decision by panels in the USMCA or the parties comply with those decisions, or sometimes governments override the compliance of their commitments. So there is a selective compliance of obligations. Obviously, we have saw this in the cases of the US rules of origin. This creates an incentive for a future decision of the GMO corn in terms of try to settle this issue bilaterally or in a negotiation. We also have heard that in the case of Canada, there has been 2 cases about this issue. So this procedure has created, the proceeding of dispute settlement has been created to depoliticize trade irritants and have a mechanism at technical level to resolve trade. But if there are several obligations that has not complied by the parties, it creates some type of uncertainty and lack of credibility of the agreement. And the third point that I want to raise is that obviously the review of the USMCA is a relevant point that needs to be, that the 3 parties needs to take advantage. Obviously, is the clear opportunity to correct any perhaps issues or to address new areas of cooperation. As was mentioned before, we really believe that new areas like environment, climate change, technology, AI, cybersecurity are areas in the agreement that has not been very well developed. So there are some provisions, for example, on digital trade, but these provisions are very general, and now what we are seeing globally is that digital trade is one of the key areas for maintaining the competitiveness of the region. So we need to be more creative and ambitious in providing a vision of optimization of the process on the border and in the areas of economy to maximize competitiveness. I think that the private sector, civil society need to provide a vision and key information, data, and context regarding how governments can work together for mutual benefits. And returning to the point of the USMCA revision from the Mexican perspective, we need to ensure that we come to the table with clear understanding on what will happen between US and perhaps Canadian relationship with China. Mexico has maintained very inward position. We have a relationship with China, but Mexico has not taken a strong policy with respect to the trade relationship with China, and there is no clear strategy on that. So I think that with this element, I conclude my remarks, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Orlando. David.
Thank you. The 2026 review has been pretty well covered by the 3 previous speakers. I would only add that if you're worried about political situations, there's no easy way to deal with it. 2026 is the congressional elections in the US. 2027 is congressional elections in Mexico. 2028 is the US presidential election. 2029 might work. 2030 is another presidential election in Mexico. So I agree with the other speakers that there are political reasons why 2026 probably won't result in an extension of the agreement, but I would just caution that other years are not very helpful as well. I'm going to talk about two areas. The first one about dispute settlement under the USMCA after 4 years, because this was one of the areas where major changes really took place compared to NAFTA, and then just a few notes on what's going to happen in 2025. As most of you know, there's a new rapid response labor mechanism that we did not have in NAFTA. It's very different from the NAFTA side agreement on labor, which was essentially useless. The actual rapid response arbitral mechanism has only been used once. And the panel on procedural grounds said the case isn't covered because it predates USMCA. But there have been about well over 20 cases that have been settled by agreement between the U.S. And Mexico, which suggests to me that in many other areas, if there is the potential of mandatory dispute settlement, third-party dispute settlement, it encourages parties to work things out. And so I consider this to be one of the major benefits, advantages of USMCA, even though it deals just with individual companies. And there are dozens or hundreds of other companies which have the same problem. So it's not going to resolve the issues in Mexico quickly, but it's moving in the right direction. Secondly, as in NAFTA, as in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, there's a binational panel mechanism to deal with administrative actions in anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases. It doesn't really change much from NAFTA Chapter 19. It just moves to USMCA Chapter 10. There have been a handful of cases filed, and as usual, the dispute of more than 40 years between the US and Canada over software lumber tend to dominate. The mechanism suffers from the same delays as we had under NAFTA because appointment of panels of 5 independent arbitrators is very slow. There was one panel on softwood lumber, for example, that had a hearing a couple of weeks ago. It was initiated in 2021, so it took over 3 years to get to the hearing stage. Major changes were made in the mechanisms for investor dispute settlement. In Chapter 14, there is no longer an ISDS mechanism between the U.S. and Canada. The U.S. and Canada and Mexico can resort to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but they don't have any action under the USMCA. And in a few sectors like telecommunication, electricity, petroleum, transport, and some infrastructure, the mechanism is pretty much the same as in NAFTA Chapter 11. In most other areas, it's much less useful. You have a 3-year period for exhaustion of local remedies, which will become even more complicated given the judicial system changes that are now taking place. You have a ban on fair and equitable treatment and indirect expropriation, which have been the basis of most of the claims under NAFTA. So depending on your point of view, if you believe in ISDS, you can see this as a big disadvantage. If you're among the increasingly large numbers of members of the Congress of both parties that think ISDS gives corporations incentives to move abroad, then you probably welcome what's going on. Finally, there's the state-to-state arbitration provision that has been actually fairly widely used in USMCA. It's broader in subject matter than NAFTA was for claims which conflict, non-violation claims conflict essentially with the objectives and the understandings of the parties, which means it can be applied in investment matters as well as a lot of others. What really changed things is it's no longer possible for one of the parties, read the United States, to block the process by simply refusing to appoint arbitrators. The penalties for not appointing arbitrators were so severe that all 3 parties appointed their arbitrators before January 2020, when the mechanism went into force. But a number of cases, Meredith mentioned several on milk products. Canada brought a case against the U.S. that they won. Canada and Mexico brought a case against U.S. approaches to auto rules of origin. It's very technical, but it's very important with regard to trade. The U.S. lost this is back in 2022, but has consistently refused to comply. Recalling there was a case in 2000 involving cross-border trucking. And some of you may remember where compliance by the U.S. didn't begin until 9 years later, only after Mexico imposed trade sanctions. There's a pending U.S. action, again, that has been mentioned against GMO corn by the U.S., but I think with Mexico having an interest as well. We were expecting that case fairly soon, but it hasn't come out. Maybe they're waiting until after the U.S. election. Mexico, in order to win, has to demonstrate that there are scientific studies showing there are health dangers of GMO corn. The EU was unable to do this in 20 years in the WTO, so I suspect Mexico will have the same difficulties here. The recent, again, as Meredith mentions, consultation, beginning of the process by the U.S. against Canada's digital services tax. Who knows how that will turn out and when. I would say the process overall has worked pretty well procedurally, except there is a troubling pattern of parties who lose cases to comply, and the prevailing parties have been very reluctant to impose trade sanctions. I don't know how that gets settled eventually. Trade challenges 2025, well, the most obvious one is what's happened in the last few weeks here. Mexico's movement toward a one-party state with Congress, judiciary, elected presidency, and the formerly independent agencies like anti-competition, energy, telecommunications, all being under control of the Moreno party. Lopez Obrador leaves office October 1, but many of us believe he will cast a very long shadow over President Sheinbaum and over the Moreno party in the future. If you add that to some of Mexico's other challenges in attracting foreign investment like crime, drugs, corruption, electric power shortages, one I think has to worry that the direct foreign investment is going to suffer very substantially, which is bad for Mexico and it's bad for the U.S. as well, because a declining economy in Mexico means more immigration to the United States. In terms of the two parties, I agree with Mr. Mahoney. I don't think in substance, there's a lot of, likely to be a lot of difference. I think Harris mostly will follow the Biden administration. I think, as with Biden, it will be a more difficult, more diplomatic way of dealing with these issues, but at some, I believe a Danish politician said 3 or 4 years ago, Biden administration trade policy is the same as Trump with manners. And I think that's a very good characterization. And I would guess that Harris is going to move in the same direction. You're still going to have disputes over Chinese steel that may have been transshipped through Mexico, labor rights issues, and GMO. I would not be surprised at all, particularly if there will be new restrictions, particularly on the import into the U.S. of EVs that happen to be made by Chinese companies in Mexico, which don't exist yet, but may in the next year or two. I would also agree that immigration will overshadow pretty much all other U.S.-Mexico relations under a Harris administration. Trump, again, we don't really know. If there are new across-the-board 10 or 20% tariffs on everybody, I doubt that Canada and Mexico will be excused. Obviously, if Mexico does not continue to cooperate on immigration under Sheinbaum, which I don't think is very likely, the Trump administration is likely to threaten, as it did in its first year, the first time around, 5 to 25% of additional tariffs for the lack of cooperation. Trump will probably put new 60% tariffs on China, which may increase the pressures for nearshoring into Mexico, or more likely reshoring into the U.S. Though if much of this investment goes to the U.S. with all its disadvantages rather than Mexico, it will not help the Mexican economy. I think the judicial so-called reform is going to increase in friction between Mexico and the U.S. Congress and the U.S. President, whoever that may be, and obviously with foreign investors. AMLO, who obviously will be gone in about 12 days, at least from the presidency, said last week about the reform, the corrupt justice ministers and judges, are they going to continue to deform this? Are they going to continue defending foreign companies that come to loot, rob, and affect the economy of the Mexican people? That attitude is not a good one for attracting foreign investment, but it pretty much reflects AMLO's policies for the last 6 years. There's a widespread belief expressed publicly by the Canadian-Mexican ambassadors a few weeks ago that the new governmental policies are going to be a downturn for Mexican democracy. One observer says decades of hard-fought reforms aimed at ensuring fair representation, transparency, and checks on executive power are at risk. Today's pluralism, a cornerstone of Mexico's democratic evolution, and that's something that pretty much began in the 1990s, may well become a thing of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And Rolando. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone. I'm super pleased of being here. I think that the timing of the publication of the book wasn't even in a better time. Because, you know, at this time, David, Tony, bringing these 11 chapters on whatever we're stating, it's on the hot spot of what is happening in the world and in between our economies. I think that the challenges that we were facing between our relationship, as Orlando said, it's super important on the next administration. I think that also the U.S.-Mexico Center will be playing a role important to make decisions, not only recommendations in an academic way, even more than a pathway to follow public policies. And from that, I think that in the context of having in 2024 50 elections, presidential elections in all over the world, where are deciding the 50% of the GDP in the world, and in Mexico, US, and Canada, only in these countries, there are only 30% of that GDP. It's super important, whatever we are deciding and whatever it's in the context. Also, as Mahoney said, between the US, if it's Biden or if it's Kamala, we will be facing also, if Biden comes to power, maybe he can be empowered in between for trading, or his speech, which is super toxic about talking immigration and ethnic things, but maybe he is a businessman, and also he knows what does that means talking about prosperity. And if Kamala comes to power, she can be more reliable on public policies, but also she will be thinking on getting her first task, which will be being reelected in 4 years. That's how power is, and we can't deny it. So the attitude in the Mexican side, I think, like during the Mexican Country Outlook in December that the Baker Institute presented, in the speech of Jennifer Pierce, the TransCanada CEO, said, I think that we will be facing, or we will be hoping to know the real Claudia in power. And I hope, and I'm optimistic that this could happen, because I think that she is a person that takes evidence for decisions. She collects data, and there is a main difference in between AMLO and her. She doesn't have any other data to take decisions, like he says. And also, I think she will be advocating on the revision or the review of the of the USMCA. And one of the most important things that I can highlight on this is that yesterday, the next Ministry of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, already called the high-level authorities in October the 15th. So this is going to be her first public main event, calling 20 CEOs of the world talking about the review of the USMCA. Even because there's a lot of information about talking the judiciary reform that it is supposed to be toxic. I don't know if it's going to be. We hope that that could not be the case. And I could hope that this public event could highlight and underscores what is the most important goal that she will be achieving. And also talking about the region and talking about Texas, and talking about the New World Disorder. We just heard India like 2 weeks ago here talking about that, and talking about our region, talking about Canada, and talking about Texas and Mexico. I think that we are sharing commercial challenges. We are sharing cultural relatives in between our 39 million people origin from Mexico living in the US. And also talking about sustainability, we're facing also challenges in between the climate change and the environmental thing. Talking about the pandemics, what we learned is what we have to share solutions in between. And also talking about job creation and money, also I think that there's a lot of incentives between Texas, the US, and Mexico, and Canada to continue on the USMCA. Also, the role that Texas will be facing, I think that the first advocate to do this will be Texas. Whatever it happens in Texas is fantastic. It's amazing. It's the motor of the economy of the next 50 years in between Mexico and the US. We're talking about the 8th largest economy in the world. We're talking about the leader of job creation in the US, and we're talking about whatever Governor Abbott has been doing in business, in the responsibility of having a border state, which face also immigration problems. I think that talking about whatever is happening on the Texaplex, San Antonio, Dallas, Austin, and Houston, it is super important because we need to work on business climates, about talking infrastructure and sharing infrastructure in between the states that are bordering with Texas, which is Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Coahuila. Talking about foreign direct investments, Texas has been, for the 22nd year consecutively, the first main attracting land in the US. And talking about that, whatever influenced Texas influenced Mexico. And talking about reshoring of the businesses from Asia to the US, its best option first would be Texas. Obviously talking about the land, the infrastructure, the electricity, and talking also the rule of law. But as Mahoney said, all the businessmen will be thinking that maybe Mexico would be the first option, and it is not. And it is not because we are lacking, are facing super important challenges. On whatever I have read from Marcelo Ebrard is gonna present is, they're gonna talk about 10 industrial parks. And also we will be having some infrastructure problems on trading on the border. And also we will be trying to invest on railroads in Mexico in order to fulfill this necessity. I think that our US, Texas, Mexico binational relationship, it's already done, it's increased, it's unstoppable. I think that the trading of $800 billion, I heard Glenn Hammer last week from the Texas Business Association saying that now it's the world of the trading between Texas and Mexico. And also that states in between all the trading between the US and Mexico, 1.6 million per minute trading business in between our economies. So the private sector, the Texas-Mexico Business Commission, will face these new challenges, recommending and trying to bring an agenda of visibility. I'm looking for Mexican entrepreneurs here that creates jobs, that are from the first time in his lives living in the US. And I think that the influence that we made on the economy is crucial. We don't have that much visibility on the political side, but we are facing a lot of problems, and we are facing from our small businesses that we open daily in the US and in Texas, some opportunities that we can influence. And also we will be the first ones to help our economy or our friends to the supply chains, talking about the friendshoring. I think that there's a lot of work to do. We have to stay positive. I think that the bicultural influence is unstoppable. I think that if it depends for us that for me to bring the salt and the bread to my table, you have to sell me your glasses. I will do whatever it takes to do that. So this is unstoppable. Even though good or bad, or maybe not that bad, public policies. So we have to make conscious that we are a bicultural region, and we have to work on that.
Thank you. Let me ask a couple of questions of the panel, and then we'll open it to a conversation. This is the first time this morning that I hear that the renewal of the USMCA is not a given. I thought it was 99%, but now I'm beginning to think, there's a lot of political interests underneath that, and there's a lot of different dates that don't make it politically convenient to for renewal. It's not dead immediately on July 2nd, but the clock starts ticking. And then added to that is the worrisome comment that Meredith just made about business planning, and how they plan for 5 and 10 years, not the next year, and see if it happens in 27, 28, and 29. Is there a fallback position? Can the WTO, the MFN, you're back to basics, even if it's not a privileged access, can that provide a fallback position for businesses to make their calculations in planning? Meredith?
The short answer is no. I don't think so. And part of that is because we now are in such a world of asymmetries, with U.S. influence and power and leverage so much larger than that of Mexico and Canada. And my genuine fear is, and we heard it this morning a little bit from the comments made by CJ, is that the United States is fully aware of this leverage and plans to use it to its full advantage. And so if you're a business trying to think about, well, where are you going to set up? Unfortunately for Mexico and Canada, increasingly that looks like the United States is the smart bet. Because if you're not really sure what the ground rules are with trade with anybody else, Europe, China, Mexico, Canada, then you better locate in the United States, where you know that things will be tariff-free because you're not crossing any border. Right. And I think the Americans are smart and know that. You all are smart. And so I think for a country like Canada, one of the things that we need to do is get very, very smart around our natural endowments and our competitive advantages. One area of that, two areas of that are in energy, critical minerals, LNG, those kinds of things. And we need to frankly become a bit more brass tacks about our trade in those areas, and start linking those in the same smart ways that we see the Americans doing.
So here's another question for you before I get to David. If Mexico does not correct its direction, because it's making terrible mistakes, the López Obrador administration has clearly been a nationalistic administration. David cited this kind of rhetoric that President López Obrador has used, that these foreign companies come here to exploit our people exfoliate our resources and take everything away, and this kind of toxic rhetoric for businesses and trade. If there is no correction under the Sheinbaum administration, and I have some doubts that I think she's a little bit corralled about how much room for maneuver politically she's going to have to correct the course that he's laid out for her. I think he gave her a playbook, and I think it's going to be very difficult. It's going to take at least a couple of years for her to step outside that playbook, as far as I can tell, and I can envision the future. But given this more nationalistic tone in the United States, in Mexico, will Canada's position then gravitate towards a 1989 agreement and say, this is kind of dead-ish? We'll go back. Trade between Canada and Mexico is important, but it's not that important as it is with the United States, and say, we're on our own. Canada will have to renegotiate some sort of side agreement with the United States and skip the USMCA altogether.
Yeah, so I think you're touching on an important issue, which is that in the USMCA negotiations, there was a lot more cooperation between Mexico and Canada than I think we will see in the USMCA review. And that's because increasingly Canada and the United States positions are finding more natural alignment. We've already found alignment around a lot of the issues on US-China competition. Canada has more or less adopted those policies. We're still not quite sure where Mexico is going to land on some of that, with Chinese headquartered companies coming into Mexico, which also affect jobs in Canada. And so I think that if you look at bilateral trade between the US and Canada, it has only increased over time. If you look at trade between Canada and Mexico, while it has increased, not nearly to the same extent. And so it continues to be something that neither country focuses on very much. We continue to always focus on the United States. I think that's bad for North America broadly. I think there's reasons that we should continue to try and push the North American agenda, and I'm someone that tries to do that. But I would not say that I always have a lot of company in my country doing that.
Okay, David, chime in on this question. Questions?
Go again?
The uncertainty of having a USMCA not ratified in 26, and then the fallback position, and then Canada's deciding in this game theory where the hunter sort of says, I'm going for the hare, forget the stag, this kind of game.
I agree with Meredith that if things do not go forward on renewal in 2026, which I think is a very, very high probability, you could see some sorts of side agreements. I don't think it would be a redo of the NAFTA or the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, but side letters, side agreements are very much a part of Canadian and U.S. trade negotiations. So if there were specific issues where Canada and the U.S. basically agreed on what they're doing, like the China policies at the moment, I could easily see side agreements on those. I could see side agreements on energy because Canada and the U.S. are both open to foreign investment in energy, critical minerals, things of that sort, where Mexico probably isn't. I would say certainly isn't. And other areas of importance, maybe even something on, as Mr. Mahoney was suggesting, on artificial intelligence. If you can't get Mexico to be interested in this, you start out with Canada, the U.S., and then you bring in Australia, the U.K., maybe Japan. I would add South Korea. And so I think there are a lot of possibilities depending on which issues the countries want to focus on. If Canada brings up softwood lumber again, that's going to poison the atmosphere. It's been going on for 45 years. The U.S. politically is not going to budge on it. And hopefully the U.S. will let dairy alone. But if you could eliminate a few hot button issues like that, as you've suggested, I think Canada and the U.S. are on the same, well, I would add the digital services tax. Canada and the U.S. most of the time are on the same wavelength when it comes to trade issues. So yeah, I would think side agreements are there. On the other hand, in many respects, Mexico is more dependent on trade with the U.S. than with Canada, so I think even the Sheinbaum administration would be extremely nervous if the U.S. and Canada were going off and negotiating things on their own. But none of that suggests to me that 2026 is going to be the magic year.
Yes.
I just want to jump because in my view, and I think I am in the same situation like you, I at least in Mexico, we have never thought that it was already, that there is a possibility that in 2026, the review will result in a complete decision that the US is not in a position to confirm to maintaining the agreement,
right,
to be honest. So we always thought that, and checking the text of the provision that basically says, that the idea of this review is to have a joint review of the provision of the agreement and review any recommendations for action submitted by a party and decide any appropriate actions. So internally, I guess in Mexico was probably this process will say, well, if we want to maintain this agreement, you need to do this and this and this and this. So, right, like an action decision for the problems that perhaps some countries is facing. So obviously it's tough, but this idea to maintain everything in suspense for the next year and for the next year during the 10 years period, I think that in my view creates a lot of noise for business environment. Yeah. So I hope that perhaps the decision in the review was to review clearly what is the problems in Mexico, perhaps Mexico and Canada against the US or the issues with Canada, and try to have this to-do list of actions that they need to implement in order to maintain the agreement.
Yeah, the reason why I say that Sheinbaum is a little bit corralled in her ability to maneuver politically is because he's kind of given her a playbook. He's passed constitutional reforms that she's going to have to implement, and that's going to take 4 or 5 years. Yeah. That's going to keep her busy, number one. Number two, he has made his son the general secretary of the Morena party, which means he will have a direct control of the party. Three, I think Congress, which is now turned into a rubber stamp Congress, will be loyal to him, not her. So it's gonna, she's in a tough position.
That's true.
But the trade agreement opens I guess an opportunity for her to say these changes have to be implemented if we want to continue having full and thorough access to the American market. Salinas pulled that off successfully, but I'm not sure that the conditions today, ideological conditions and political conditions, are the same. So she has a narrower path to get there and to actually pull the party into reversing some constitutional changes and making some changes to the law. So it's a lot more difficult to get there. David, you want to say something?
Yeah, just on a slightly different topic. We've been talking a lot about the problems with the judiciary and the Mexican issues. You know, a visitor from Mars might say, well, you're talking as if the U.S. is a font of political and economic stability, which is simply not the case. We could easily end up on January 6th, that's the day after the election, with no one knowing who the president is going to be, and with it taking a month or two the way it did last time. We could have a situation in which one party controls the judiciary, as it already does, the presidency, if Mr. Trump is reelected, and both houses of Congress. And, you know, as Americans, we can say nasty things about what's been going on in Mexico right now, but we have to look in the mirror occasionally. I'm not at all sure this is going to happen. It may not happen, but in terms of private businesses expecting stability, you know, what happens if a Trump administration imposes 60% tariffs on Mexico and 20% tariffs on everybody else? It radically changes the business climate. And there may be American companies who decide they'd be better off doing business as home offices in the UK or Australia or Japan or somewhere else. So just a caveat. as we sit around here talking about some of Mexico's problems, look in the mirror.
Yeah, I want to get to you, Rolando, for your comment, but let me add to whatever you're going to comment this particular question. Texas, you correctly pointed out, is the big elephant in the room. Texas is the origin, destination, and transit of 2/3 of a $800 billion binational trade. But the Texas elite is not so gung-ho on Mexico or the border. So how do you, in your work, as kind of someone who promotes the idea of Texas as a strategic partner, reconcile the idea that, yeah, there's important interests in the Texas congressional delegation, which is 40 members of Congress, right? 2 in the Senate, 38 in the House, could potentially make a big difference here, but at the same time, their own inability to understand that rubbing against the federal government is not a good strategy to either get their commercial interests well cemented in Washington. Or there is a contradiction in there in the Texas political class. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite weird, but as I started to say, Texas will be the first advocate for this, because whatever you said. And also talking about what does this implies to Mexico and for the Morena Party and the judiciary reform and all the fear that is coming in Mexico on how the Claudia Sheinbaum administration will be doing. I think that somebody told me yesterday, come on, take it easy. It's going to be the pre of the 80s.
Oh my God.
Okay, if it's not going to be the idea, then we will be remaining Carlos Salinas. And then we will be remaining thinking how he made this free trade agreement, made it happen. But it's not the case. Obviously, there are it's another kind of different world, and the challenges between the federal government and the state levels in the US, in Texas, and in Mexico are quite challenging. Talking about migration is going to cause a lot of tensions between and the federal level, which is the main tension which Greg Abbott maintains against Joe Biden administration. And talking about Texas, particularly talking about the climate change, talking about the federal regulations that comes from the energetic transition in Texas, Texas is obligated to do that. And come on, talking about oil and gas industry, and talking about the differentiation between Biden and Trump, it's enormous the way that they think. And the businessman and let me say this, all the businesses are waiting on November on what is going to happen on Biden or Trump.
Right.
And from there,
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris and Trump. And from there, we will be seeing Tesla, if it happens or not.
Yeah.
We will be seeing Mexico Pacific. We will be seeing TransCanada. And obviously, those kind of things are waiting like in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And talking about Texas, I think that the challenges that a commission like this are facing, or the relationship or the binational commission is waiting, it's also like the Sonora, Arizona Commission, and also the Cali Baja Commission, which is looking for regional trading solutions. And even if the free trade agreement or the USMCA does not meet the signing, we will be doing our work. And one of the things that we learned on the book is the revision of the WTO. And this could be helpful on whatever. The commercial thing will not be stopped.
Yep.
So our relationship between cultural things and talking about the labor force in Houston, in Texas, which this year was 15 million get through the labor force. And from there, 60% were Latinos, which is 8.4 million. And from there, 88% are Mexicans origin.
Yeah.
6.9 million Mexicans are part of the workforce. And we're as an ethnic group, and I congratulate that here is the responsible for the Small Business Development Center from the University of Houston, which handles that in Texas there are 3.2 million small businesses. You know, Tony, from there, 35% are Latinos, and 100,000 LLCs are from Mexican origin. So if we were talking about that trendings and cultural ties, we're talking about that there are a lot of stimulates or incentives to make this happen. And that's why I'm stating that Texas is going to be the main interested. And as I said, Claudia Sheinbaum is eager to do that. The first public thing that she is going to do is going to join the revision of the USMCA.
No, I have no doubts. I'm just talking about the constraints that she's going to face, because she also has a much more ideological and radicalized Congress. I know that Marcelo Ebrard is probably a good figure to contain some of the radicalism. He understands the stakes, but you know, the U.S. has its own interests, and you know, there's all kinds of. I think a game theory analysis of the USMCA might be the stag hunt game is a good, a good game to understand the interests and how any one of these players might go after the hare and abandon the stag hunt. David, and then I think I saw two. Yeah, there you go.
Just to mention the fact that if companies that are moving from Asia decide against nearshoring in Mexico and reshore in the U.S., Texas will be the largest beneficiary by far because of their location, because of their anti-union pressures, low taxes. They are the biggest attraction if you decide you don't want to go to Mexico.
And I have already, and I think we've already seen, in fact, over the last 6 years, Texas has been the #1 beneficiary of the López Obrador mistakes. The triangle, Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston are largely the dynamic economics of the triangle are being fed by an exodus of human capital, financial capital, talent, professionals from Mexico. You can see it. It's not just workers, lower skilled workers that are coming to Texas. I mean, this is Texas economy is being fueled, and we saw the tweet, I guess, by the Texas Policy Foundation saying, "Come to Texas. Mexico is becoming a mess. Come to Texas." And I don't know if that's a smart strategy, but we see it, and I think that particular tweet reflects a lot of the sentiments in Texas about what's going on and how Texas can take advantage of a potential further deterioration of the business environment in Mexico. Yes, and then I'll come back to you, Roland.
Good morning again. I totally agree with Dr. Payan in terms of his vision of what the Claudia Sheinbaum government is going to be. I believe that public opinion in Mexico, and I'm talking about analysts, academics, journalists, still want to give the doubt beneficio, el beneficio de la duda, we say, to the new government, but we do not have evidence that the new president will act in a different way. She has appointed her cabinet, and we can see that most important members of her cabinet are belong to López Obrador and will be following the López Obrador playbook that has been said. So I really believe that this naivety is what brings us to this stage in Mexico right now. We are still hoping that this is going to happen differently. We are still hoping that the secondary legislation of the judicial reform is going to soften what the reform has already established. From the beginning of this government, we said, no, he will not cancel the airport because it's already in a 40% stage of advance, and he did. And if we don't read properly what this person is, López Obrador, we are going to be mistaken in the next decisions that we are doing.
All right, I'll come back to that. Yes, another question over here, and then we'll come back to the panel. I think in front of you, Lisa, right here.
I had read one article that attributed the president-elect's success in the election to the benefits derived by the Mexican working class from USMCA. Is that true? Does that influence maybe her future decision toward trade?
All right, David, let's go down the line.
Well,
if you have any other questions, I'll be looking out for hands. Yes.
I think one of the things I learned a long time ago when I was looking at trade agreements was trade agreements are thought by most of us to be useful and helpful in terms of getting investment, building jobs. They're not sufficient. The internal politics, internal legal structure of Mexico, or certainly since 1994, or any other country, are essential to all of those benefits. I mean, NAFTA was a good example. The government at the time thought that's all they had to do. They didn't have to reform the judicial system. They didn't have to lower tariffs to a reasonable level. It took Mexico 10 or 12 years before they finally figured out we have to do other things for the economy, and then they did most of them. So I think it's quite clear that the trade USMCA potentially can be very helpful, and I think it is being helpful. Could it be more helpful? Yes, it could be if Mexican policies, certainly during López Obrador and others, had been much more favorable.
Meredith?
I'll let my Mexican colleagues talk about
Rolando.
Mexico.
Thank you. Well, talking about another issue that we have to highlight and to underscore, it's why this is unstoppable. And in the US, from the 39 million origin Mexican that we live here, we paid last year $360 billion to the IRS. And in Texas, just in Texas, the apportation for taxes was $50 billion. And in remittances, that was valued in $60 billion. And also talking about Texas, that apportation just in Texas was the $30 billion, the half. Obviously, everybody will be encouraged to do something about what would the USMCA review will be significant to Mexico. And with that, I think that the context is still super important on the stimulus or the incentive that Claudia is aware about.
I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, I agree with you that there is a momentum here, and that a lot of that momentum is created by small and medium-sized businesses and professionals and investors and workers, and so there's a certain impulse to the whole thing, and I don't think that the trade is going to go away. I don't think investment is going to go away. Those things will continue.
Yes.
The problem I see is not that much will be there, but how much will be left on the table by not having the right policies and the right agreements to turbocharge that momentum for greater benefit. And then, to the point that was made this morning, the ability of policy to distribute better the benefits of trade. If we don't do that, we're not going to do too poorly, but we're certainly not going to do well. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and we're going to be leaving a lot of wealth and wealth creation on the table, and especially if we don't consider, like you said in your question, the benefits that trade can certainly produce, and around which there is so much skepticism today.
Yeah, and this is why I think that perhaps the remaining counterbalance that Mexico has, considering the concentration of power of the executive with the legislative and the judiciary now, is this trade agreement and what other trading partners could reflect on what is happening in Mexico. And nothing is written in a rock or in a stone. So I think that the upcoming administration should be able to listen what is happening, to use these tools, the USMCA or the review in 2026, and perhaps saving face internally and do their jobs to correct some of the actions, or as was mentioned at the back, softening at least the damage that has been raised with these reforms. I think that is my personal view. I think that the USMCA or the trade agreements need to push perhaps these decisions, and perhaps we will see a correction of this type of policies.
I'll ask David to close. Back there are some flyers for I guess we got one more question and then I'll let David to close. There are some flyers for the book if you want to, it's a 30% discount I think, if you want to order the book and read it. I think there's a lot of interesting points that have been discussed this morning, more deeply elaborated in the book. One last question. David, you close. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Tony. Recently, we've seen numbers around that Latin American GDP in the U.S. is about $3.2 billion and could be about the 5th economy in the world. And that's around 70% or something about Mexicans. So how do you think that influences the people that are negotiating? I mean, because I don't know exactly if Mexico by itself has that in mind, and also how does it affect on the U.S. Persons that are negotiating this treaty?
Yeah. David, I guess if you want to close and then, look, I think that there's a lot of truth to what you say, and there's a lot of evidence. And I think Rolando has pointed out correctly that there's a lot of momentum to this, and people are going to continue doing what they do, investors and producers and manufacturers and exporters and importers and things like that are going to continue. What is at risk here is not so much that, but is what can be prevented from occurring, all the good things that could potentially happen if we have the right framework, if we have the right agreements, if we have the right policies. And I think what is at risk, not only by a rarefied ideological and political environment, but also by all the obstacles by choice, because many of these policies are really choices that are made by our political leaders everywhere, in Canada, in Mexico, in the United States, et cetera. And I think they might just leave a lot of prosperity and competitiveness for North America on the table if they don't really come together, So it's about something else. It's about a zeitgeist type of thing that is at stake, at play here, more than the fact that those of us who do our daily work are not going to do our daily work. What we definitely have to understand is that, and I think it's an important point that Hansen points out in his paper when I read that paper, is that what we made a mistake on is that we didn't distribute the benefits of trade right. And that has created the political environment that we face today, where we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's a clear mistake that we cannot make again. It should be a lesson that we learn for the history. David, you close.
Yes, 2 points. One, an opportunity for Scheinbaum. There have been 25 investor state arbitration cases brought against Mexico during AMLO's term. None of them under the USMCA, most of them under NAFTA Chapter 11, the so-called legacy provisions, but you also have 2 under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 2 under the Netherlands BIT, 1 under BIT with China, 1 under BIT with Spain. Should Scheinbaum and her advisors decide it would be a good idea to settle some of those cases, or most of those cases, that would send a very positive note to potential investors. Number 2, my understanding is that the first election of judges is going to take place when?
2025.
When?
In June.
Okay.
In June.
potentially that could be a very difficult situation if that election with hundreds of judges and all sorts of interference doesn't take place. And I think that there will be some potential investors who wait to see how that's going to turn out.
The book is divided into 3 sections: global governance of trade. The second section is on the USMCA, which we just discussed. And the third and final conversation will be on China, the big elephant in the room. So the next panel, moderated by my colleague and friend Stephen Lewis, after a small break where you can get some water and coffee, will be on China and trade in North America.
We're supposed to pick up a lunch, aren't we?
Yes, there's a lunch out there, and then in the middle of lunch we'll begin the next panel. So we'll have a little break, and then we'll start the final panel. Thank you. Thank you all.
So we're about to begin. Okay. Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to the second panel on U.S. and China. And I'm Steve Lewis, the CV Star Transnational China Fellow here at the Baker Institute. Obviously, I have a lot of interest in China. I'm a political scientist. I focus on Chinese domestic politics, so I'm learning a lot about trade and economics as well. We have our panelists you can see in the program, but let's go ahead and get started. We'll have each of the panelists, just like the format of the previous panel, each of the panelists will give a short presentation and then we'll open it up for discussions. Our first panelist is Daniel Chow from Ohio State University, and I believe he's all linked up, so please go ahead and start your presentation, Daniel.
Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from Shenzhen, China, where I am a visiting professor here teaching at Peking University in their Shenzhen campus for the fall semester. So that's why I couldn't be with you in person. Because
good morning.
I'm actually, yeah, it's actually
late evening,
30 in the morning that I'm speaking to. Okay, so let me talk about U.S. trade policy towards China. So the Biden administration recently imposed new 25 to 50% tariffs on various products from China, including semiconductors, solar cells, batteries, steel, aluminum, graphite, and syringes. In addition, the Biden administration also imposed a 100% tariff on electric cars from China. This is due to concerns that China will start shipping cheap electric cars to the United States due to excess manufacturing capacity. So the 100% tariff on electric cars effectively closes off the U.S. market for Chinese electric cars. Now, we'll see where this goes, but BYD, which is the largest manufacturer of electric cars in China, is looking to set up a factory in Mexico to manufacture electric cars for the U.S. market and to take advantage of the zero tariffs for products from Mexico to the United States under the United States, Mexico, Canada Trade Act, the USMCA. So we'll see where that goes and whether China, in fact, can get zero tariff treatment for any cars that it produces in Mexico. But that's what's happening with the Biden administration. Now, these tariffs are of a dubious legality under the World Trade Organization, because you just can't raise tariffs whenever you feel like you need to in order to be more competitive and in order to protect your industries. And I think that there would be a basis for China to challenge these tariffs and probably be successful. But due to the current crisis in the WTO caused by the inability of the appellate body to meet, the WTO is currently unable to enforce any of its rules. So if the United States imposes these tariffs, they're going to be, the United States is going to be able to act with impunity because these rules, these tariffs cannot be challenged under the WTO. Now, with respect to autos, China, one of the reasons why the United States imposed the 100% tariff on electric cars from China is that China has now become the world's largest exporter of automobiles, surpassing Japan in 2023. And this is pretty remarkable considering that about 20 years ago, just at the beginning of the 21st century, China was really not a player at all in automobiles, in automobile manufacturing. And in just about 22 decades, China has now become the largest exporter of cars in the world. This is very concerning to the United States. And how did China achieve this? Well, through the use of massive subsidies. So from 2009 to 2022, China provided $29 billion in subsidies. And when you look at this, in 2009, at the beginning of this period, China only sold 500 electric cars, okay? And by 2022, China was selling 6.8 million electric cars. So you go from 500 to 6.8 million in a little bit over 10 years. And 2022 marked the 8th consecutive year, in fact, that China had the largest electric vehicle market in the United States. And by contrast, the United States sold only 800,000 electric vehicles in 2022, which is less than 1/8 of the 6.8 million sold in China. Now that I live in China, I can tell you that if you go into the street, you can see that probably half of all of the cars are electric cars. You can tell by the license plate which cars are electric. And I would say half of all the automobiles that are currently on the road are now electric. And many of these cars, since I've been in many of them, are actually quite advanced and have lots of features that I don't see even in Teslas, which are also, which are also plentiful here in this market. Now, in addition to autos, China intends to dominate the microchip market, the production of microchips, which of course are used in computers and all kinds of electronic devices. And China's goal is to achieve global domination in the microchip industry by 2030. And China has spent $150 billion in subsidies today in the microchip industry, with another $145 billion in subsidies under consideration. If China were to absorb Taiwan, Taiwan itself accounts for 68% of the total chip production in the world and 90% of the world's most advanced chips, then China would become far and away the most dominant player in global chip production. So all of this has got the United States actually quite worried. And the reaction of the Biden administration has been to provide billions of dollars in subsidies to the US microchip industry in order to compete with China. And these billions of dollars that the United States is providing also covers electric vehicles and green energy power. So the Biden administration has boasted, in fact, that it has a new transformative US industrial policy, which to me looks like the United States has just taken a page out of China's state capitalism playbook, and is simply providing subsidies in order to compete with China, which has itself, of course, provided these massive subsidies in both the auto and in the microchip industry. So what has the United States done? It has it is engaging in the same tit for tat with respect to subsidies now. And this new transformative policy that the Biden administration is talking about is based upon the use of these massive subsidies. And these subsidies are contained in the following legislation: the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the American Rescue Plan. Under the CHIPS and Science Act, the United States has already provided billions in subsidies to Intel, Samsung, Microtechnology, Taiwan Semiconductor, all of whom are now promising to build manufacturing facilities in various states of the United States. Okay, so a couple of things about this that I think we can say with respect to U.S. trade policy, and it's also its implications then for the WTO. What the United States is doing with respect to this, to these subsidies that it's providing, is it's really exposing itself to actions under the WTO Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Act, which target government subsidies. And in this connection, a actionable subsidy within the WTO refers to any financial contribution provided by government to a company or firm that confers a benefit. In this case, the United States is providing subsidies which are specific to an industry or to a group, in the case of the microchip subsidies that are included in the legislation that I've just talked about. And this would mean that the United States would be subject to massive penalties in the form of countervailing duties, which would be imposed upon U.S. subsidized microchips. So countervailing duties are simply an additional tariff which can be imposed upon a product to offset the effect of a subsidy. And these massive, I mean, these would be in the billions or tens of billions of dollars in terms of penalties that the United States would be open to if it were to, if U.S. subsidies were targeted under the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Act. If we have time, I can go into why Chinese subsidies, however, have withstood a challenge under the subsidies under the WTO, and I can get into a little bit of specifics of why that's true. But what this, I think, indicates is that the United States must maintain its blockade of the WTO. That is, that the United States must have a disabled World Trade Organization, because if the World Trade Organization is revived, then the United States would be open to massive financial penalties for the billions and billions of dollars that it's providing under U.S. legislation. And I don't think that the United States can withdraw the subsidies. The United States can't stop providing subsidies, because once you've provided billions of dollars to U.S. companies, it's really politically impossible to ask them to disgorge and to return those payments. So I think that what this is telling me in any event is that the crippling of the WTO, the disability of the WTO, is something that is going to continue indefinitely, if not permanently. And the United States has made a number of claims that it is going to revive the WTO, that it intends to have a fully functioning WTO by the end of 2024. I think all of that is just simply for political purposes. I don't think the United States has any intention of fully reviving the WTO to its full power and full functions that existed before it became crippled in 2019. So this is where I think what this indicates to me, and it indicates also this, I think, of for the foreseeable future, the use of subsidies by the United States, by China, and other countries. And other countries will also do the same thing, and we're going to see massive, competition through the use of subsidies with which could create lots of problems for the global economy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chow. So maybe I'll turn to our next speaker. Next to me, we have Jorge Gonzalez Henriksen, CEO of the Nearshoring company. So please give your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tony, for the invitation to be a speaker today. I am the CEO of the Nearshoring company. We support non-Mexico manufacturing companies to successfully operate in Mexico. The company has been doing this for 32 years. So we've seen, as a company, because I haven't been there the 32 years, a lot of ups and downs in the US-Mexico trade relationship. But I would say that it's been mostly upward. And in my role as a businessman, we tend to be overly optimistic, and we continue to see that road going upward. Being in this role has allowed me to see and experience and learn what I call the trenches, which is the day-to-day engagement with US companies that want to go to Mexico, Chinese companies that want to come to Mexico, and we'll talk about that in a moment. European companies, we have clients from Europe as well. But also, I always want to retain a more objective distance view of the situation as well, right? So whenever we discuss where we are now in terms of global supply chains, manufacturing abroad, it gives me mixed feelings in reality. If I view it from the trenches, again, as a CEO of a company that supports manufacturing in Mexico, what is going on, I view it as very positive. And positive because we have seen it. I mean, you go to border towns in Mexico with a history of manufacturing, even cities not on the border like Monterrey or the Bajío region, and business is booming. I mean, you feel it, the traffic is there, it's difficult to get real estate, manufacturing real estate. We're now experiencing even in some cities, difficult to find labor. So you do see what is going on. But then from the more distance point of view, I get worried to see what is going on. At least I have always been taught, probably because of my age, that globalization has brought the world the greatest wealth creation the humankind has ever experienced. It has brought peace after World War II. And now seeing it being disentangled, I do get worried. And Tony, you mentioned something that got me thinking, or probably put in words what I've been thinking, that because of trade, this trade surplus has been divided inappropriately or something around those lines, then we want to throw the baby out with the water. And so that is concerning. I mean, from a personal and a more theoretical and a human point of view, that this is happening. But again, from a more immediate and business mindset, this is a great opportunity for Mexico. And I've said this before, even if we blow it up, which it seems like what our politicians are doing. But even in this case, Mexico will benefit. I mean, I think we could have benefited 5 or 10 times more if we would have had a different federal government with a different ideology, because I think it really comes to that. I think it's a very ideologically charged government in Mexico right now that is in power. When people have asked me what would that look like in your mind, probably South Korea type growth rates come to mind. I think that could have been, and if I want to be optimistic, we might get a chance of that still. But again, even if we continue in this course, that is not, I think, the best one, we would still see positive growth in Mexico, like what we're looking at. I do remember when I was here also in the Mexico Outlook event, somebody asked me, like, I mean, everybody's talking about nearshore and nearshore, like, what is all the fuss, you know? I mean, Mexico has been manufacturing for foreign companies since the 1940s or the 1950s, right? We had the Maquila the Bracero program, the Maquila program. Like, what did Mexico do for this thing to be all over the place right now in the news? What is this golden opportunity? And I said what I'm going to say now, that in one way, Mexico did a lot. You know, since the program that used to be the Bracero program and the Maquila program has evolved significantly. And Mexico used to be an oil-oriented economy. And the company was transformed now into a manufacturing economy, right? It took a long time. We signed NAFTA, and you have cities, especially the ones on the border, that are now a third-generation manufacturing population, right? So skill set has grown. We have signed not only, everybody thinks of NAFTA, but Mexico has other 12, 14, if I'm not mistaken, free trade agreements with other countries. It's a very, very open country in terms of trade. And so there's a lot of homework that Mexico has done so that now it's in a position to say, hey, we're here to capture new business in manufacturing. But at the same time, Mexico didn't do anything to benefit from what's happening. It all had to do with the US and China, right? Which is the topic of this panel, right? So Mexico has been a spectator of this battle of heavyweights and sitting in the sidelines in a way, and actually benefiting, as I was saying, already happening from what is going on. So I remember I joined the company a little more than 5 years ago, and we always used to talk about, you know what, China is a great place to manufacture, but it's not the China of your parents, right? I mean, it's more expensive now than it used to be, and you keep hearing all these anecdotes of, I have a client that says, well, I used to go visit a plant, everybody would walk to work, and then next year they would use a bicycle, then 5 years later they use the cars, and now everybody has high-end cars, right? So, I mean, China, of course, has gotten richer and has changed. So our thesis had always been, I mean, like, what used to be a no-brainer to go to China. Now, I mean, Mexico is a good option if you don't want to have all the negative sides of manufacturing that far away. But after the pandemic, things really exploded, and again, I think from the Mexican perspective, in a positive way, right? So, I mean, as I was saying, it is very positive. You see it, you hear it, you read it. The amount of Chinese investment is incredible. I mean, people speak that almost 40% of what the country has captured as Chinese investment from Chinese company is 40% of so far, and it keeps on growing very, very quickly. And there are a lot of issues, as you have all been hearing about, well, what is the US going to do about it, right? Because yes, I can confirm that a lot of these conversations with Chinese companies tend to start in a way that it's, how can I make this a Mexico product, right? I'm building this motor and I want to ship it to Mexico. What do you have to do so that it's properly stamped as a Mexico product and it qualifies under NAFTA. I'm not saying every company does that, but that's usually how the conversation starts. Then it starts to go in the direction of, well, you have to classify doing X, Y, and Z. You have to have this content of Mexican value in it. And so Chinese companies, what I've seen are starting to adapt. And they're manufacturing more in Mexico, which I think is positive for Mexico, because Mexico in this process, again, was not expecting what happened after the pandemic. So we weren't really all that ready to capture. Even if it's very small in terms of global terms, for Mexico it was huge. And there are not enough suppliers, not enough specific deep supply pools of skilled labor, which I think the Chinese are bringing to Mexico. And so I think it's, at the end of the day, it is positive, but yes, there is a big question mark with US elections happening. What is going to happen in response to these Chinese companies manufacturing in Mexico? I mean, they're going to be taxed differently. Controls are going to be more costly to manage. But again, at the end of the day, we believe this is positive. And the final point that I want to talk about, why we're so positive about what's going on from a business perspective, is demographics. I mean, I didn't start my career in manufacturing, and I was one of those persons, and you don't have to raise your hand if you feel identified, that you don't know how things are made at all, right? So everything is taken for granted, right? But when I went into manufacturing, I was surprised that to manufacture the smallest piece of plastic takes a room this size, and a lot of people and a lot of dollars, and it's very complex, right? And so, I mean, manufacturing takes a lot of money, takes a lot of expertise, but it takes a lot of people. And some things cannot be automated. As much as we love to think that robots can do everything, there are a lot of things that they cannot do yet, or it's prohibitively expensive to do it in that way. So we still need people. And China has a demographic issue. And the US also has a a huge one. And I would go as far as to say that the main driver for companies to reach out to us right now is we cannot find employees. We cannot find people. And I don't see the US turning to immigration to solve that anytime soon. So, hey, Mexico comes back to the picture to help. And so I do hope that trade dominates over politics. From a business perspective, from a wealth creation perspective, and from a peace perspective.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Jorge. We turn to our final speaker, Simon Lester, who is a non-resident fellow here at the Baker Institute with our Clayton International Economics program.
Well, thank you to the Baker Institute for inviting me. Thank you to Tony, David, and Lisa in particular, and some others too, for arranging all of this. So I want to start out with a question about US-China trade, and that is, what does everyone in the US want from China on trade? When I say everyone, that could be US government officials, policy wonks in DC, people on this panel, people in the audience. What does everyone want from China on trade? And I want to put out a few possibilities. These are things I've heard out there is what people might want. So one is, people want China to be more like us in terms of the role of the market in their economy, in their economic policy making. Another possibility is that people want China to fix the bilateral trade deficit by buying more from us and selling less to us. And then third, people just want China to go away so our companies don't have to compete with their companies in the US market. And there's some overlap among these, and there's some variation. These are sort of three general categories, and I put them out there because which of these we prefer will guide the approach that we take to setting up rules surrounding trade with China. So if the choice is just to keep them out, well, the answer is simple. Unilateral tariffs, other sorts of trade restrictions, they'll do the job. I mean, there's a cost to the economy, but we know how to do that. if the focus is on getting rid of the trade deficit, well, then we need to be willing to address the actual causes of the trade deficit, which are more about macroeconomic policy, so differences in government and personal savings rates among between the two countries, among the US and other countries in the world. But it doesn't seem to me that we are, so I don't anticipate much progress with dealing with the trade deficit. I think the trade deficit will continue, and there will continue to be misunderstandings about what causes the trade deficit. But then finally, if we want China to be more like us, in the sense of being more market-oriented, and I think that's what we should want, because I think that would make both China and us better off, well, then we need to discuss questions of strategy. How exactly can we nudge China in that direction? And speaking generally, nudging countries, influencing their domestic policies, it's a delicate operation, not an easy thing to do, but I do think the foundation has been laid at the WTO, and I think some progress could be achieved here if we made it a priority of US policy and if we thought carefully about what might be effective. So let me now just kind of briefly go through some of the history to talk about how we got to where we are now. So in the late 1980s, in the 1990s, the Bush 1 and the Clinton administrations put a lot of effort into crafting international rules that would make China more market-oriented. So as part of China's WTO accession, when they joined in the WTO, China agreed to a set of WTO plus obligations, basically meaning they agreed to do more than what everyone else agreed to do. And a lot of this related to the functioning of China's economy. The US-China bilateral negotiations here were particularly important, and China's economic structure was at the core of those negotiations. So China joins the WTO in 2001. And at that point, progress on pushing China to become more market-oriented might have begun in earnest, but something got in the way. After 9/11, the focus of US foreign policy shifted elsewhere. So instead of pressing China on its non-market practices, as might have been expected in the summer of 2001, the US got caught up in the Middle East, the Iraq invasion, the war on terror, and in that process, the US often needed China's non-objection to its plans there. So these trade concerns got bumped down the list of priorities. Now, to be clear, even with these political constraints, the US did bring some WTO complaints against China, and they were reasonably successful when they did. But on the big picture principles related to the market orientation of the Chinese economy, the US often left these WTO rules unenforced, did not press China as much as might have been expected when the rules were being negotiated. Let me breeze through a bit more of the history because C.J. Mahoney talked about it earlier. So during the Obama administration, the focus with regard to China was on creating this regional trade agreement to counter China, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That failed in terms of US domestic politics. So the rest of the TPP countries went ahead, and there is a TPP out there, but the US is not a part of it, so it doesn't really work as this way to counter China. And then under Trump, Trump has been very clear how he feels about trade. He's a tariff man, he said. He wants us to be a tariff nation. He imposed lots of tariffs. And then the Biden administration mostly continued those on. CJ was telling us about this earlier. And interestingly, in their decision to continue most of the Trump tariffs, and actually, as Daniel pointed out, impose some new ones as well, the Biden administration seems to have acknowledged that this hasn't worked in terms of changing China's trade policies, and in fact, they say China has doubled down and things have gotten worse. So that leaves us with the question of, well, what now? And I do want to acknowledge something that Daniel said about the WTO dispute settlement system not functioning properly. That is the case with regard to the US. Other countries have actually come up with an alternative to the appellate body. So if you have a dispute between Australia and China, or Canada and China, or the EU and China, they can use WTO dispute settlement, and they have. But it is a problem for the US. And so a condition for what I'm saying is the US should restore functionality to the WTO. I know that goes counter to what Daniel was saying. We could discuss that in the comments if in the discussion afterwards if we want. So I'm assuming that yes, the U.S. will get on board with fixing WTO dispute settlement because we want to use it. So as I said though, for what to do now, finding the right approach to addressing trade problems with China depends what your goals are. And some people seem to think the whole effort to integrate China into the world economy was a mistake. China was never going to change. China was never going to become market-oriented. And so this group of people has just given up and just wants to shut China out. But there are others out there who are saying things like, well, no, we still want to influence China in a more market-oriented direction. And so I'm really speaking to that group. I mean, if you're in the group who wants to shut China out, well, then what I'm saying is kind of irrelevant. But if you're in the group that wants to make China more market-oriented, then the question is, well, how do we do it? And I think what experience tells us is WTO complaints are the best option here. The unilateral tariffs that have been tried for the last few years haven't worked. Whereas the WTO complaints, people who have looked at this have examined, well, how did China comply with these complaints brought against it when it lost? Well, they've done reasonably well. I say reasonably well because, I mean, they did as well as the US or the EU. Nobody's perfect in terms of complying with WTO decisions that you're in violation of the rules. The problem is the complaints that have been brought have tended to focus on narrow industry-specific issues rather than these kind of broader systemic issues about the structure of the economy. And so what I argue is that if we want China to become market-oriented, more market-oriented, as again, I think we should want that, it'd be good for them, it'd be good for us, it's time to test out these broader obligations that China took on. So to illustrate that, let me give you an example. As part of its accession commitments, China promised that it would ensure that all state-owned and state-invested enterprises would make purchases and sales based solely on commercial considerations. That's a pretty broad obligation. China agreed to it, and complying with it would have a real impact on China's economy and on trade with China, and other countries' trade with China. So, but it's not self-enforcing. Somebody actually needs to actively hold China to this. Somebody needs to file a complaint and say, China's not complying, and make their case and get a ruling that China is in violation. Now, I want to be clear, I don't want to overstate the case here. I never like to overstate things. There's no guarantee of success with WTO complaints, and in some circumstances, unilateralism might work, at least in the short term. My argument is that based on the evidence, based on our experience, overall, I think WTO complaints provide the best overall chance of success in nudging China on these systemic issues about the structure of the economies. So summing up, if we want China to become more market-oriented, we have to make that a priority of U.S. foreign and economic policy, and so far, in my view, it has not been. U.S. always has multiple things it wants from China, and these trade issues often get pushed down the list, shoved down to the bottom. We can decide what we want the priorities to be. If non-market practices in China are a priority, well, we can elevate them beyond where they have been. To be clear, I don't really anticipate a big change here. I think that we are going to keep going the way we have been going, and there will always be some other issue that takes precedence over trade. But for those of us who think it is an important issue, we need to argue for it. My argument is that this aim back from the 1990s of integrating China into the club of market-oriented countries, it's a good idea. It's still worth pursuing. I think the way things played out after China's accession to the WTO was a missed opportunity. But if we made that issue a priority now, as it was in the 1990s, I think we might be able to make some progress.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all of our speakers. This will be, I guess, a good time to open it up for questions from the audience. I think we've got microphones being passed around. Maybe in the middle there. Yeah.
With regard to semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan, do you see the Taiwanese industry being able to untangle themselves from China and resource or more friendly sourcing than they have now?
I can try to take that on. I'm not a semiconductor expert. I don't know if Daniel has anything he wants to say about it. I mean, I think that China and Taiwan obviously have their, well, we know they have their broader tensions, but they have their own trade tensions. I think that that's going to be a battle between the U.S. and others trying to bring back semiconductors to the U.S. and the Chinese trying to, it's going to be a kind of a three-way battle, I think, because the Taiwanese are pretty happy with their leadership position in this industry. The U.S. and other Western countries are uncomfortable with that and want to bring some of the leadership back to the U.S. and other Western countries, and then the Chinese are also sort of fearful about getting left behind, and they want to advance. So yeah, I think it's a three-way battle that will. I don't know how it will be resolved. I think that is the limit of my expertise on it. I don't know if Daniel has any insights on that.
Yeah, so we can invite Daniel Chow if you have some comments. if you want to address that.
I would say that that Taiwan and China may have a lot of political issues, but they're very economically integrated. And in terms of untangling this economic relationship, I don't know that Taiwan really has any real incentive to do that at this point. So if you're asking if it can be done, maybe, but I don't see that Taiwan has any incentive to do that.
I think I can chime in just one little part to that. I think a lot of Americans don't know that Taiwan has 20-some million people, but about 10% of them historically have lived in China, mainly in Eastern China, doing business, running small enterprises. And over the last decade, a lot of them have been leaving. And their Chinese partners have also been leaving, going to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, looking for cheaper, labor costs, because labor in Eastern China is too expensive now. And Chinese governments at local levels recognize that, and the Taiwanese do too. So that's another part of the changing formula. I think somebody over here had a question. Yeah.
Yes, this is for Jorge. I know you guys were speaking on China, but I had another country in mind. How might the increase in Russian diplomats in Mexico and China influence future U.S. trade policy, especially in terms of countering Russia's growing influence in addressing potential economic or geopolitical impacts? I know that Russian diplomats surpass even the Cold War era of 60%. I guess the Russian diplomats are at 72 and China's at 38. And these are companies such as like Lukoil Lubricants and Rostec that go through Mexico.
Good question.
Well, yeah, that's a big question. I'll try to answer that as best as I can. So one, I'm not an expert on that issue of Russian companies and Russian intelligence, and even to that matter, Russian relations with Mexico. But I do remember some of my history, and Mexico and Russia have had a history. Mexico has always. Someone this morning said it in their own words, but sort of always has flirted with these regimes that are in a way even enemies to the U.S., which is a very dangerous tightrope to walk on. But I don't know if everybody remembers, but Leon Trotsky was murdered in Mexico City. He lived in Coyoacán. And he was very close to Mexican politicians and artists and Diego Rivera and all these characters. No? So again, Mexico in this maybe mixing ideology with even geopolitical positions has always got warm and cozy with these governments. You can put even Cuba in that mix that was obviously heavily influenced by Russia. And so now with this government that we have talking about López Obrador, Morena, and Claudia Sheinbaum, I mean, they are, as I mentioned, ideologically charged, and they're left-leaning. So I would not be surprised that they are opening certain doors and channels for Russian interests, probably in a very, I don't know how open this is politically in Mexico, but I wouldn't be surprised, again, given the history of Mexico and Russia and what the negotiations are underwater around this whole shifting of supply chains. So I guess it was pretty broad, but I'm not an expert in that. We don't have any Russian clients, by the way. Russian companies.
I have a question, Stephen. Help me unpack a little bit the issue of the triangle China, Mexico, U.S. Because I think there's a lot more in there than meets the eye. And David and I are about to embark in a new project on China in Mexico. And that's key because there is a lot of concern in the United States that Mexico may become a trampoline for China's strategy to maintain access to the U.S. market as the U.S. market begins to close. That's one kind of a back door, not so back, I guess, a side door to maintaining this. And I think your question about your statement about the question that the Chinese companies that consult with you begin, is a really interesting one, which is how can we make this product to be a Mexican product sufficient to be inside the walls of North America and take advantage of the USMCA. That's not going to fly in Washington. I think it's going to, increasingly you hear on Capitol Hill concerns about that. The Trump administration is certainly going to come back to that. The Harris administration, if it happens to, is likely to look at that again. So our project is going to look at that. It's very hard to tell what exactly China's activities are in Mexico, because sometimes they're triangulated as Dutch companies or some other. So you have to really dig in there. It's hard to understand the extent of these activities. So I wonder if you guys can comment to this triangle and the risks to the USMCA, to North American integration, that China might be doing that. How can Mexico assuage some of the U.S.'s concerns, legitimate and perhaps illegitimate, because in the United States we are in the habit of trying to find good enemies because we function better when we have, good enemies or adversaries to fight against. But it is a real concern, regardless of how imaginary or not, or yes, it might be. It is a concern, and that puts a lot of other things at risk. So, what are the extent of Chinese activities? How can they be better managed? How can Mexico balance that? How can Mexico address U.S. concerns on China? What do you see there? How can China be held accountable for being transparent about its activities, whether it's just purely commercial, shoes and chairs, or strategic, electric vehicles and packaging, chips packaging and things like that in China? In Mexico, but they're really Chinese activities. Can you guys talk more about that and what that means and how to handle that in the coming 5 years, decade?
You want me to go? Yeah, I can give you a couple thoughts. So one thing that's worth noting here is I've seen some legislation proposed that would restrict imports based on the company rather than the country. So if it's BYD, we don't care where they produce it, they're going to get a higher tariff. Now, I don't know if that's even possible to administer. When I saw those kind of proposals, I thought, I've never heard of anything like that. It's not how we normally do things. Can you do that under U.S. law, practically speaking? I'm just not even sure. But there are some people who are recognizing the concerns you put out there and saying, well, this is how we're going to deal with it. We're just going to say if it's from a Chinese company, we don't care where you're locating, you get these extra tariffs. Now, we'll see if that goes anywhere. I think C.J. Mahoney pointed out earlier, it's always safe to bet against legislation passing, but some people have put it out there as a way to address this problem. And then more broadly, I think what we have here is a combination of political and then technical issues. So the broader politics suggests exactly what you're saying, is there are massive concerns about this and people coming up with how are we going to restrict Chinese efforts to bypass the U.S. tariffs and invest in Mexico and then take advantage of the USMCA lower tariffs. So that's sort of the broader political thinking out there. But then there's a really interesting technical point that probably requires customs lawyers and other more specialized trade lawyers. I don't know, maybe David has experience with these things. I don't think I do. So the Chinese and Mexicans they're working with who are trying to make this work as a way to have investment in Mexico and sell it in the U.S. are going to think about, well, how do we structure these operations so that we can be classified as Mexican and take advantage of the lower USMCA tariffs? What exactly do we have to do here? It can't just be an assembly plant where there's the name BYD on the factory and then they just kind of put a couple pieces of the car together and then call it a car. No, they really have to do a lot in Mexico, but then there will be people in the U.S. saying it's not enough, it's not enough. So what is the level of of actual operation in Mexico that can make this, that can make it safe so that you will be able to count this as a Mexican product that can be sold in the U.S. And I feel like that is going to be a long-term kind of push, legal battle, like people trying to figure out what will work under the current law, and then somebody else in the U.S. saying, no, that's not good enough, and ratcheting things up. It'll be a sort of constant sort of ratcheting on both sides. Like, we're making this more Mexican, this Chinese investment more Mexican, and then somebody in the U.S. saying, well, that's not enough. It's not Mexican enough, and we're going to try to get the Customs and Border Protection to rule that this is not actually a Mexican product. So I think this is just going to be a long-term battle of trial and error, companies setting up operations, trying to get rulings from U.S. authorities that are favorable, getting them sometimes, not getting them, then having Congress or regulators changing the rules to make it harder. It's going to be very lucrative for lawyers who spend the next 10 or 15 years trying to figure it all out and help their clients take advantage of, as long as the USMCA exists. And I guess we all think it's going to exist even if it doesn't get renewed in 2026. It's still going to exist at least till 2036, if that's the number. But so as long as it exists, there will be somebody trying to take advantage of it in this way. But just, the technical battles are going to keep us all occupied for foreseeable future.
Can I chime in on that, please?
Sure.
So just going to the technical issue. On the technical side, it's really a question of rules of origin. So with respect to the USMCA, it has a very, very detailed set of rules of origin, which any product which comes from Mexico is going to have to satisfy in order to be deemed a product of Mexico and thus subject to zero tariffs when the product enters into the United States. So with respect to automobiles, since that's a big issue, the rules of origin for automobiles are extremely stringent, and one of the big changes in the USMCA over NAFTA is that the rules of origin for automobiles were tightened significantly, really at the insistence of the United States, to protect the U.S. auto industry from the exact thing that China wants to do, which is to set up a manufacturing operation in Mexico and ship those cars to the United States as products of Mexico and duty-free. That's going to be quite difficult to do under the current regime, under the current rules of origin for automobiles. But I expect that China will attempt to do so. I expect that China will attempt to satisfy these rules of origin, and perhaps the United States will try to tighten them, but it's not just a U.S. issue. The rules of origin are the rules of origin for the USMCA, so Mexico will have something to say about efforts to tighten the rules of origin. But that is going to be a technical battle that's going to be fought as China attempts to evade the U.S. tariffs by going through the USMCA and getting their products into the United States. I would also expect that China will be very creative in terms of the kind of corporate entities, and they will probably, I think China will attempt to set up subsidiaries and holding companies so that you have a Dutch company, for example, which is really owned by a Chinese company that's going to attempt to set up operations in Mexico. So there's going to be a lot of very interesting issues. I agree with Simon that there are going to be a lot of interesting issues for trade lawyers in the next decade or so as this battle between China and the United States, and with Mexico in the middle in terms of how to get products from China into the United States duty-free.
Yeah, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Yeah.
Just to expand a bit on Dan's point, there are three basic ways that, let's say, this hypothetical BYD factory in Mexico could try to export to the U.S. The most difficult one is clearly rules of origin. You need 75% North American content, $16 an hour wages for most of the people. The second version would be just to use the MFN tariffs, which are 2.5%, which if when you compare it to 102.5% if the product comes directly from China, don't mean much. But that means that there has to be a substantial transformation. And part of the BYD's problem is the Chinese government has said recently, if you're going to build auto plants in Turkey, in various countries, what you ought to do is just assemble knockdown groups of components. If they do that in Mexico, it won't be considered a substantial transformation, and it may well be considered evasion of Chinese duties going to the US. So I think BYD has some real challenges until the point in time, as Dan points out, where they can source a lot of their parts and components in Mexico. And typically that takes being there 5 or 10 years before you can really do that. So I think they have a very significant problem, even if the US doesn't block imports of Chinese cars from Mexico on other grounds.
Thank you. Maybe one more question? Over here.
I guess that my question goes to the same area, but not related to manufacture. It's more related of the U.S. policies with respect to technology and software vis-a-vis what happened in China. What do you see that it will be perhaps the U.S. policy, not only in the U.S. territory, but with trading partners with respect to the advance that China has on cybersecurity issues, artificial intelligence, software technology, and all that stuff that are goods that sometimes are traded, but not through customs. So there is no tariff issues, so there is a different type of regulations. What will be your thoughts about that?
I mean, the U.S. is pushing very hard right now, domestically and with trading partners, not to give away data and related kind of technology security to China. And so there's an investigation going on right now by the Commerce Department about connected vehicles, and it's basically focused on whether a Chinese vehicle sold in the United States with all this software with data that could go back to China is undermines our security. And I don't know what's going to come out of that. It's not really clear what the remedy here is. But so we're looking at these issues domestically, and we're pushing all of our trading partners and allies to think about things in the same way. And I think that we're going to have, the US government is going to have some success with that, and I think some allies will be more likely to get on board, and others will be a little more wary for various reasons. I'm not sure where Mexico is going to come out on this. I would think Canada, the UK, Australia are going to try to align with the U.S. And I'm very curious, how Mexico, reacts to the U.S. pressure and how they think about it internally. Do they see this as something that's really a risk to them? Is China, the Chinese government, accessing the data of Mexicans? Is that a problem for them? Is it a problem that American companies access Mexicans' data? I don't know how everyone around the world thinks of it. I have a sense they worry less than certain people do in the U.S. It's a big deal for certain people in the U.S. I'm not as sure it's as big a deal for everybody else. It may be in part because it's not their. For most people in the world, it's, well, some other company or government has all my data, and what can you really do about that? Whereas in the U.S., it's concerned about the Chinese government in particular. And yeah, I'm sort of just watching and waiting to see how Mexico reacts on this myself.
So I think we're right
Can I
about
chime in
time.
on that?
No, somebody.
Daniel.
I was going
sorry.
to chime in on this if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the United States has imposed strict export controls with respect to U.S. technology to China. So these are strict controls on what products and what type of technology can be exported to China. And there are a number of Chinese companies, I think quite a few now, on a blacklist that cannot receive these types of products from the United States. And this would apply to U.S. products that not only come from the United States, but that go to a third country and then that are then re-exported to China. So, for example, if you have U.S. technology which has been sent to France, the French can't re-export that technology to China, and they would also fall within these controls. So the United States is very strict about that. The United States, excuse me, also is now very strict about Chinese companies which come to the United States and purchase and buy U.S. companies with technology, and all of that is undergoing strict review by CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So the U.S. has itself these controls. Now, can it influence other countries to impose similar controls? That's a political issue, because that, of course, the United States doesn't have really any power or any legal authority over other countries and how, what kind of export controls they have on their technology. But, the technology that China really wants is really technology from the United States. So, and that's now being subject to these strict controls. That's what the United States is doing about it.
Okay. Well, thank you for our speakers and for the questions from the audience. And as moderator, if I can use my prerogative to just end on a provocative note, because I'm just utterly entranced by Daniel's mention about just how, all the gigas and doodads on Chinese electric cars, I think raises a kind of an interesting question here. Maybe we can think more as consumers and maybe as economists and go, what is it about the competition in China that's driving all of this innovation? And we can think of a lot of sectors, as Tony mentioned, sectors like oil and gas, critical minerals, things like that are critical to the national security of many countries, including China's. But the question is, should we consider automobiles to be one of those? Because I would say historically, that's one of the most open, most competitive industries, because the central government never owned, a car company, a gasoline-driven car company. So for decades now, you've had Buick, you've had, every different, province in China has a different foreign partner. All these foreign car companies have worked. And the result has been an intense competition amongst gasoline-driven car companies. And now they're all losing to private companies, Chinese private companies that drew on all that knowledge and all those markets and how to bring in all that, and then also sell them to create electric car companies, right? That are now driving all the gasoline-driven car companies, including joint ventures that are partly owned by foreign companies, out of the market. So it'd be nice if out of all of this, we managed to keep that innovation that is driving that in the same way that the whole world has benefited from Silicon Valley, and the intense kind of innovation that comes out of that. On the automobile industry, it'd be a shame if we ended up killing, the innovation that drives the Chinese electric car company industry. It'd be nice if there's some way to open it up so that we can all benefit from it going forward. So anyway, but I learned a lot today, and thank you very much, everybody, for your questions and for our panelists for their knowledge. Thank you. I think you have final comments. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly one of the many who learned a lot today. Just a few very brief closing remarks. First of all, I think Mexico and U.S. relations have a number of very serious challenges coming up in the next year or two, not just the judiciary, quote, reform, close quote, that we've seen, but also issues, as this panel has, I think, very well demonstrated, regarding the impact of U.S.-China problems on Mexico, particularly transshipment of Chinese steel to the U.S., which is a really hot-button issue at the moment, in addition to the only potential at this point, of Chinese auto companies making cars in Mexico and exporting them to the U.S. I agree with our moderator that this poses huge risks for the classic auto companies, for General Motors, Chrysler / Stellantis, but also for VW and Mercedes and BMW in Germany. I mean, much of the innovation in the electric car business outside of China is coming from Korea, South Korea, Kia, and other manufacturers there, Hyundai. So I think there are huge risks to having a highly protectionist auto sector and other sectors in the U.S. And my hope would be that whoever is running the government, beginning in January, hopefully, if we've chosen somebody finally, will look at the China threat saying, well, vehicles may be there, EV batteries may be there, semiconductors, but let's not fuss with clothing and shoes and refrigerators and TV sets. Most of the TV sets are made by Chinese companies in Mexico for export to the US. So that's one point. I think there's an awful lot to discuss, maybe enough for another edition of the book in a few years. Secondly, if you're interested in the book, it's best to order it from these leaflets because it's about $12 cheaper than it is from Amazon.com. Finally, I want to thank you all very much for being here, for listening, for asking some very provocative questions that helped, I think, all of us to benefit from being here. So thanks again.